The wind did not merely blow across the Siberian steppe. It possessed the land. It claimed the vast, white emptiness as its own property, a sovereign force that tolerated no resistance and offered no mercy. Here, in the deep heart of the Trans-Siberian expanse, the wind was a physical weight, a solid wall of moving air that pressed against the earth with the heaviness of iron. It carried the cold not as a temperature but as a texture, a grit that scoured the skin, a fine powder of ice that found its way through the tightest seams of wool and leather. It was the winter of 1919, bleeding slowly, agonizingly into the winter of 1920, a transition marked not by the turning of a calendar page, but by the deepening of the snow and the hardening of the frost. The world was rendered in deep blues and charcoal grays, a sketch drawn by a heavy hand on dark, rough paper, where the only light came from the pale, indifferent moon and the dying embers of distant fires. On the tracks, the train stood still. It was a serpent of steel and wood, frozen in its coil, a long, dark scar against the pristine whiteness of the taiga. This was the train of gold, the legendary transport carrying the imperial reserves, a treasure so vast and so heavy that it seemed to anchor the very earth beneath it. But out here in the biting solitude of the wilderness, the gold had no value. It could not be eaten. It could not be burned for warmth. It was merely weight. It was merely metal, as cold and unyielding as the rails upon which the wagons rested. The train had been stopped for hours, perhaps days. Time had lost its rigid structure in the whiteout. The wheels, massive iron discs, were rimmed with frost, welded to the track by the ambient moisture that froze the moment it touched the metal. The grease in the axle boxes had thickened to a glue-like paste, resisting any thought of movement. A guard stood near the third wagon. He was a statue carved from felt and wool, his silhouette bulky and shapeless against the shadowed bulk of the train car. He wore a heavy greatcoat, the coarse wool rough and gray, reaching down to his ankles where it met the thick, layered felt of his Valenki boots. The coat was stiff with frozen moisture, standing away from his body like a shell, a personal fortress against the encroaching night. Around his neck, a scarf of rough yarn was wrapped multiple times, covering his chin and mouth, leaving only his eyes exposed to the biting air. His eyelashes were white with rime, heavy with the moisture of his own breath which froze the instant it left his lungs. Every exhale was a cloud of tiny crystals, a momentary fog that lingered before being snatched away by the relentless wind. He did not move. To move was to invite the cold to shift, to find new pockets of air to invade. To stand still was to maintain the fragile ecosystem of warmth he had trapped between his layers. He shifted his weight imperceptibly from one foot to the other, a microscopic motion designed only to keep the blood flowing, to remind his toes that they still existed within the tomb of his boots. The snow beneath him was packed hard, a platform of ice that squeaked with a dry, high-pitched complaint whenever he adjusted his stance. The sound was swallowed instantly by the vastness of the silence that lay beneath the wind. It was a silence of waiting, a silence of endurance. The taiga did not speak, it only watched. The train car beside him was a wall of vertical wooden planks, reinforced with steel strapping. The wood was dark, weathered by years of crossing the continent, absorbing the soot of the locomotive and the dust of the plains. Now it was coated in a sheer glaze of ice, reflecting the faint starlight in dull, distorted patches. Inside this wagon and the dozens of others stretching into the gloom lay the crates, box upon box of gold bullion, coins, and platinum. The wealth of an empire stacked in darkness, blind and mute. The guard knew it was there, but he did not think of it as riches. He thought of it as density. The gold absorbed the cold, holding it, radiating a deep, penetrating chill that seeped through the wood of the carriage. Standing next to the train was like standing next to a glacier. The metal of the train car, the bolts, the latches, the window frames, they were all heat sinks, drawing warmth from the air, creating a localized zone of absolute freezing. He held a rifle, a Mosin Nagant, cradled in the crook of his arm. The wood of the stock was smooth and dark, polished by the oils of many hands, but now it was cold enough to burn skin. He wore thick mittens, clumsy and shapeless, made of sheepskin with the fur turned inward. He could not feel the trigger guard. He could only feel the pressure of the weapon's weight against his chest. The leather sling was stiff, frozen into a rigid arc where it hung from the barrel. The metal of the barrel itself was matte with frost, a dull gray tube that promised nothing but mechanical indifference. He did not scan the horizon for enemies. The enemy was already here. The enemy was the air. The enemy was the temperature. Any human force that might wish to attack the train would first have to survive the approach, and out here, survival was a full-time occupation. The landscape stretching out beyond the tracks was a study in desolation. The trees of the taiga were sparse here, skeletal birches and stunted pines that huddled together in clumps, their branches weighed down by heavy loads of snow. They looked like charcoal smudges against the dark blue canvas of the night. There was no undergrowth, only the undulating waves of snow drifts, sculpted by the wind into sharp ridges and deep, shadowed valleys. The snow was not soft. It was hard, wind-packed, a crust that would support the weight of a wolf but break under the weight of a man. The horizon was lost in a haze of blowing snow, a blurring of earth and sky where the darkness of the ground merged seamlessly with the darkness of the heavens. There were no stars, or perhaps there were millions, hidden behind the veil of ice fog that hung suspended in the upper air. The guard's breath came in a slow, rhythmic rhythm, in through the nose, warming the air slightly before it hit the lungs, out through the wool of the scarf, dampening the fabric which then froze, creating a stiff mask over his face. He could smell the wool, the scent of wet sheep and old dust, and beneath that the smell of the train, coal smoke, oil, and cold iron. It was the smell of the railway, a scent that permeated everything, even out here in the wilderness. The locomotive, far ahead at the front of the line, was a dormant beast. Occasionally, a puff of steam would escape from a leaky valve, a ghost of white that rose straight up and vanished. The engine was kept barely alive, just enough coal fed into the firebox to prevent the boiler water from freezing solid and bursting the pipes. But there was no fuel to spare for motion. They were waiting for coal, waiting for orders, waiting for the track ahead to be cleared. The silence was punctuated only by the sounds of the cold itself. The cracking of a tree branch in the distance, snapping under the weight of snow with a sound like a pistol shot. The groan of the train's metal couplings contracting as the temperature dropped further. The hollow thud of the wind buffering against the side of the wagon. These sounds did not disturb the peace. They emphasized it. They were the heartbeat of a frozen world. The guard watched a single snowflake land on the dark wool of his sleeve. It was a perfect geometric shape, a star of ice, intricate and beautiful. It lay there for a long time, unmelting, a tiny passenger on the vast journey of the night. He stared at it, focusing his mind on its structure to keep from drifting into the dangerous lethargy of hypothermia. The 6 points, the delicate branching arms, the symmetry. It was a jewel more perfect than any gold bar in the crate behind him. His feet were numb. The sensation had receded an hour ago, replaced by a dull, wooden feeling as if his feet were no longer part of his body but merely tools he was standing upon. He wiggled his toes again, forcing the muscles to contract, fighting the paralysis. The felt of the boots was thick, but the cold of the Siberian ground was relentless. It seeped up through the soles, a creeping tide of numbness that sought to claim his ankles, then his shins. He stamped his right foot, then his left. Thump, thump. The sound was dull, absorbed by the snow. He did it again. Thump, thump. It was a ritual, a small rebellion against the static nature of his existence. Behind the train, the tracks receded into the darkness, two parallel lines of steel that narrowed until they touched and vanished. They were the lifeline, the only connection to the world of cities and warmth, but now they were severed by the distance. The sleepers, the wooden beams laid perpendicular to the rails, were buried, invisible under the snowpack. Only the rail heads were visible, glinting faintly. The train seemed to be floating on a sea of white, a ship stranded in an ocean of ice. The guard imagined the length of the train, car after car, each identical, each silent, each guarding its portion of the horde. He was one of many guards spaced out along the length of the convoy, solitary figures standing in the dark. He could not see the next man. The curvature of the track and the blowing snow obscured the view. He was alone in his sector of the night. The lantern hanging on the side of the wagon offered a feeble resistance to the gloom. It was a kerosene lamp, the glass chimney smoked and grime-streaked. The flame inside was turned low to conserve fuel, a small tongue of orange fire that flickered nervously in the drafts that penetrated the casing. The light it cast was weak, illuminating only a small circle of snow around the guard's feet and the rivets on the side of the train car. The light was warm in color, a deep, rich amber, but it carried no heat. It was merely a visual anchor, a point of reference in a world of blue and gray shadows. The shadows stretched long and distorted away from the lantern, dancing slowly as the flame wavered. The texture of the snow in the lantern light was rough, granular, like spilled sugar. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness take him completely. The wind sounded different with his eyes closed, louder, more vocal. It whistled through the gaps between the wagons, a mournful, hollow tone that rose and fell in pitch. It sounded like a flute played by a giant, a song of loneliness and distance. He felt the sway of the air against his body, the way it pushed at his coat, seeking entry. He tightened his grip on the rifle, grounding himself. He was the guardian, the watcher. His duty was simple: to be present, to ensure that the gold remained where it was. It was an absurd duty, he thought vaguely. Who would take it? Who could carry a standard bar of gold, weighing over a pood, through this snow without sinking and dying? The gold was safe because the land was hostile. The frost was a better guard than any man. He opened his eyes. The world was the same. The train, the snow, the dark sky. Nothing had changed, and yet time had passed. The cold had deepened. He could feel it tightening the skin on his face, pulling it taut across his cheekbones. His eyes felt dry, the moisture on the surface evaporating into the arid air. He blinked slowly, feeling the heavy friction of his eyelids. He looked at the rivets on the train car again, round heads of steel spaced evenly. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted them. 5, 6, 7. A row of iron buttons. They were coated in a thin layer of hoarfrost, fuzzy and white, like mold growing on the metal. He wanted to touch one to feel the texture, but he knew his mitten would stick to it, the moisture of the leather freezing instantly to the iron. A sudden gust of wind whipped up a cloud of loose snow from the roof of the wagon. The powder cascaded down like a white curtain, shimmering in the lantern light before disappearing into the darkness. Some of the snow landed on his shoulders, adding to the layer that had already accumulated there. He did not brush it off. It was just more insulation, another layer between him and the night. He was becoming part of the landscape, merging with the train and the snow. If he stood still long enough, he would become a statue of ice, a permanent fixture of the line, guarding the gold for eternity. The thought was not frightening, it was strangely comforting, a release from the need to move, to think, to feel. He remembered the warmth of the tea they had brewed hours ago, or was it yesterday? A tin mug hot against his palms, the steam rising into his face. The liquid had been dark and bitter, tasting of smoke and metal, but it had been hot. He held onto that memory, summoning the phantom sensation of heat in his hands. He visualized the liquid going down his throat, spreading a momentary glow in his stomach. The memory was faint, fading like the steam from the engine, but he grasped at it, hoarding it like a nugget of gold. The reality was the cold in his boots, the ache in his knees, the stiffness in his shoulders. The train creaked, a deep, resonant groan that traveled through the chassis of the wagons, metal contracting, the spine of the serpent adjusting to the temperature. It was a sound of immense weight settling. The gold inside the crates was shifting microscopically, the heavy bars settling against each other. Gold was soft, they said. You could bite it and leave a mark. But here, frozen to 30 degrees below zero, it would be as hard as diamond. If you bit it, your teeth would shatter. Everything was hard here. The air was hard, the ground was hard, the light was hard. He looked up at the sky again. The haze was thinning slightly, revealing a patch of darker, clearer night. And there, faint and trembling, was a single star. It was small, a pinprick of white fire, incredibly distant. It looked cold. Even the stars were frozen. He wondered if the star could see him, a tiny speck of gray on a ribbon of white. He doubted it. The scale of the world was too vast. He was insignificant. The gold was insignificant. Only the cold mattered. The cold was the absolute truth of the universe. It was the default state, the beginning and the end. Heat was a temporary aberration, a fleeting mistake that the universe was constantly correcting. He lowered his gaze back to the horizon. The wind was picking up again, shifting direction slightly. It was coming from the north now, straight from the Arctic, unobstructed by mountains or forests. It brought a fresh wave of chill, a drop in temperature that he could feel instantly. He huddled deeper into his coat, pulling his head down like a turtle retreating into its shell. The scarf scratched. The night deepened, not by the lowering of a sun that had long since vanished, but by the thickening of the silence. It was a silence that felt heavy, a physical accumulation of quiet that layered itself over the landscape like the snow. The guard stood within this silence, a solitary vertical stroke in a world of horizontal lines. The wind had momentarily ceased its howling, dropping to a low, breathy whisper that moved across the snow drifts without disturbing them. In this pause, the cold seemed to settle with renewed intent. It was no longer an assault. It was a presence, a companion that stood closer than skin, pressing against the layers of felt and wool, seeking the faint, rhythmic heat of the living body beneath. The temperature was a solid thing, a block of ice encasing the world, preserving it in a state of suspended animation. He shifted his gaze to the wheels of the train car. They were massive iron circles, forged for motion but now tasked with stillness. The metal was dark, a deep charcoal gray that absorbed the faint ambient light. Around the rim of each wheel, where the iron met the steel of the rail, a thick collar of ice had formed. It was a weld of nature, fusing the train to the track more securely than any brake. The ice was opaque, a milky white substance that looked like frozen candle wax. It had dripped from the axle boxes and solidified in midair, creating small, suspended stalactites that hung motionless. The grease, the oil, the steam, everything that once signified the life of the machine had been transmuted into this static, frozen sculpture. The train was no longer a vehicle, it was architecture. It was a long, low building of wood and iron, planted in the snow. The lantern by his side continued its quiet vigil. The flame was a small, desperate thing, consuming the kerosene with a frugal appetite. The glass of the lantern was etched with frost in the corners, intricate fern-like patterns that crept inward, threatening to obscure the light entirely. Through the clear patch in the center, the light spilled out onto the snow in a fan shape, revealing the texture of the ground. The snow here was not smooth. It was scarred by the boots of other men who had walked this line hours ago, footprints that had been hardened by the wind into fossils of movement. The ridges of the boot prints were sharp, casting tiny, jagged shadows that stretched away from the light. The depressions were filled with a darker blue, pools of shadow where the light could not reach. He looked at the wood of the carriage again. It was rough-hewn timber, painted a dark, indeterminate color that might have been green or brown in the sunlight, but here was merely a variation of black. The grain of the wood was raised, the softer fibers worn away by the abrasive wind of the steppe, leaving the harder ridges exposed. In the crevices of the grain, tiny crystals of ice had lodged themselves, creating a glittering dust that sparkled faintly when he moved his head. The wood looked incredibly hard, petrified by the temperature. If he were to strike it with the butt of his rifle, it would ring like stone. There was no softness left in the world. Even the air felt brittle, as if it might shatter if he breathed too deeply. His breath was a recurring cloud, a small, personal weather system. He watched it emerge from the scarf, a plume of gray-white that expanded and then dissolved. It was the only proof of time passing. In, out, in, out. Each cycle was a victory, a small reclamation of heat from the void. The wool of his scarf was damp against his mouth, a wet, cold patch that he had to constantly adjust to prevent it from freezing to his skin. The smell of the wet wool was the smell of his own existence, animal, organic, out of place in this mineral world of ice and iron. He felt the weight of the greatcoat on his shoulders. It was heavy, a burden of fabric that pulled him down, rooting him to the earth. The shoulders were stiff, the wool hardened by the accumulated frost, forming a carapace that restricted his movement. To turn his head required a deliberate effort, a cracking of the frozen shell. The gold inside the wagon was a silent passenger. He tried to imagine the crates again. Wooden boxes, reinforced with metal bands stacked in the dark. The gold bars, smooth and heavy, wrapped in oilcloth or straw. They were cold. They had absorbed the ambient temperature of the Siberian winter until they were reservoirs of freezing energy. If he were to touch one, it would burn him with the intensity of fire. The gold was sleeping. It was waiting for a destination that seemed increasingly abstract. Omsk, Irkutsk, Vladivostok. The names were just sounds, distant points on a map that had been erased by the snow. Here there was only the track, the train, and the guard. The gold was not wealth, it was ballast. It held the train down, kept it from floating away into the gray sky. It was the anchor of the empire, a heavy, dead weight that dragged them all into the frost. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the train. The metal groaned again, a different sound this time, a high-pitched ping of tension releasing in a steel bolt somewhere down the line. The sound traveled clearly through the cold air, sharp and distinct, before being swallowed by the vastness. Then silence returned. A profound, deep silence that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The earth was sleeping under meters of snow, dormant and still. There were no insects, no birds, no running water. The rivers were locked in ice. The sap in the trees was frozen. The blood of the land had stopped flowing. Only the wind moved, and even the wind seemed tired, dragging itself across the plains with a heavy, reluctant gait. His gloves were thick mittens, shaped like paws. He flexed his fingers inside them, feeling the resistance of the stiff leather. The fur lining was matted and worn, but it held a pocket of warm air that was his most precious possession. He could not feel the texture of the rifle stock through the mittens, only the pressure of its shape. The rifle was a part of him, an extension of his arm, fused to him by the cold. He shifted the weapon slightly, the leather sling creaking. The sound was loud in the quiet, a dry friction of frozen skin against frozen wool. He looked at the bolt mechanism of the rifle. It was coated in a thin sheen of oil that had turned cloudy and viscous. He wondered if it would fire. The striker spring might be frozen. The firing pin might be brittle. It did not matter. There was nothing to shoot. The darkness was empty. Far to the south, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. It was not the sun. It was too early or too late, he could not tell. It might be the reflection of a distant village fire or the moon rising behind a bank of heavy clouds. The light was pale, washed out, a smudge of dirty yellow against the indigo sky. It offered no illumination, only a slight variation in the darkness. It highlighted the edges of the clouds, long, flat streaks of gray that hung low over the earth. The sky was a ceiling, pressing down, trapping the cold air against the ground. The world felt like a room with the doors and windows sealed, the air growing stale and heavy. He stamped his feet again. Thump, thump. The vibration traveled up his legs, a dull shock that registered in his knees but not his toes. His toes were silent, absent. He wiggled them again, harder this time, demanding a response. A faint tingle, a ghost of sensation, answered him. It was enough. They were still there. The boots were Valenki, made of thick, compressed felt. They were gray, shapeless, and incredibly warm, the only footwear that could survive this climate. But even Valenki had their limits. Standing still on the ice bridge of the packed snow, the cold eventually found a way in. It crept through the soles, layer by microscopic layer, seeking the bone. He visualized the cold as a blue dye, seeping into the gray felt, turning it dark. The train stretched out to his left and right, a curved wall of dark matter. He could see the outline of the next car and the one after that fading into the gloom. They were identical. Boxcars, freight wagons, cattle cars converted for transport. Some held soldiers, huddled around cast-iron stoves that provided a localized, smoky heat. He could picture them inside, wrapped in blankets, sleeping in shifts, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp wool. But this car, the one he guarded, was cold. It had no stove. It had no windows. It was a vault. The gold did not need warmth. It was indifferent to the comfort of men. It demanded only security. He walked 3 paces to the left. 1, 2, 3. The snow crunched loudly, a crisp, dry sound like breaking glass. He turned and walked 3 paces back. 1, 2, 3. It was a small patrol, a microscopic journey within the vast stillness. He did not go further. He could not leave the lantern's circle of influence. To step into the darkness was to step into the void. The lantern was his tether. He looked at the flame again, mesmerizing in its movement. It flickered, dipped, rose, and steadied. It was a living thing, breathing oxygen, consuming fuel, fighting the entropy of the night. He felt a kinship with the flame. They were both small, fragile things, maintaining a precarious existence in a hostile environment. The wind picked up again, blowing a drift of fine snow across his boots. The crystals hissed as they moved, a sound like sand blowing across stone. The snow piled up against his ankles, filling the gap between the boot and the hem of his coat. He did not brush it away. It would only return. The snow was patient. It had time. It would bury the train, the tracks, and him if they stayed here long enough. He imagined the train in 1,000 years, a fossil encased in ice, the gold still inside, bright and yellow, waiting for a sun that might never melt the glacier. The thought was peaceful. No more duty, no more cold, just the eternal sleep of the mineral world. He adjusted the scarf, pulling it higher over his nose. The tip of his nose was numb, a small island of insensibility on his face. He rubbed it with the back of his mitten, feeling the rough fur against his skin. The friction generated a spark of heat, a fleeting reminder of blood and life. He blinked his eyelashes, feeling the weight of the ice that had formed on them. The world looked blurry, softened by the rime. The sharp edges of the train car were fuzzy, the light of the lantern diffused into a halo. It was a dreamscape, a drawing in soft pastel where the artist had smudged the lines with a thumb. The colors were muted, low contrast. Deep slate blue, charcoal gray, burnt umber, dirty white. There were no bright colors here. Red was a memory. Green was a myth. The guard leaned his back against the side of the wagon. The wood was solid, unyielding. He could feel the cold radiating from it, penetrating his coat. But it was a support. He let the train take some of his weight. He was tired. The kind of tired that was not just in the muscles, but in the marrow. A heaviness that pulled at his eyelids, that slowed his thoughts to the speed of the drifting snow. He watched the shadows dance on the snow. They were long, stretching out into the dark, morphing and changing shape as the lantern swung gently in the breeze. They looked like grasping hands, like reaching branches, like the dark water of a frozen river. He thought of the locomotive at the front of the train. The engineer and the fireman would be there, tending the beast. They would be covered in cold dust, their faces black masks with white eyes. They would be warm, or at least warmer than him. The firebox was a small sun contained in iron. He envied them the fire, but not the noise. Here at the 31st wagon there was peace. There was only the wind and the snow. The engine was a distant rumor, a faint smell of sulfur on the breeze. He was alone with the treasure. The treasure. He tried to care about it. He tried to feel the importance of his duty. This gold was the lifeblood of the White Army, the hope of the resistance, the future of Russia. But those were just words. Big words that belonged in warm rooms with polished tables and maps on the wall. Out here, the words froze and fell to the ground like stones. The reality was the 30 degrees of frost. The reality was the hunger in his belly, a dull, gnawing ache that had become a constant companion. The reality was the weight of the rifle and the stiffness of the boots. The gold was just metal, cold, heavy metal. He looked down at the track again. The rail was a dark line cutting through the snow. It came from the west and went to the east. It was the spine of the world. He was standing on the spine, a flea on the back of a sleeping giant. The giant was cold. The giant was dead. He shifted his weight again, the snow creaking. The sound was the only punctuation in the long sentence of the night. He waited. He watched. The wind blew. The snow fell. The train stood still. A flake of snow landed on the glass of the lantern. It clung there for a second, illuminated from behind, a tiny, perfect star of light. Then it melted, sliding down the glass as a single drop of water, leaving a small, clear trail in the grime. He watched the droplet fall, tracing its path until it vanished into the metal casing at the bottom. It was a moment of transformation, solid to liquid, ice to water. It was a small miracle. He watched for another flake, but none landed. The wind carried them past, into the dark. He felt a shiver start in the center of his back between his shoulder blades. It rippled outward, a spasm of the muscles trying to generate heat. He clenched his teeth, suppressing it. To shiver was to admit the cold. To shiver was to lose control. He stood rigid, willing his body to be still, to be like the iron of the wheels. He was the guard. He was the statue. He was the frost. The shiver passed, leaving behind a dull ache in his muscles. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his chest, expanding his ribs against the confinement of the coat. He held the breath, letting the oxygen nourish his blood, then exhaled slowly, a long gray stream of fog that drifted away to join the infinite atmosphere of the steppe. The darkness seemed to press closer, the circle of lantern light feeling smaller than before. The world was shrinking, closing in around the train. The horizon was gone, erased by the night. There was only the immediate, the tactile, the present. The rough wood, the cold iron, the hard snow. The guard closed his eyes again, and for a moment he could hear the silence singing. It was a low, resonant hum, the sound of the earth spinning in the void, the sound of the atoms of the air slowing down, freezing, stopping. It was the sound of the deep, Siberian sleep. He opened his eyes, the lantern flickered, the shadows jumped, the train waited, the gold waited, he waited. The night was long and the dawn was a distant promise that might never be kept. He settled his weight back onto his heels, locking his knees, preparing for the next hour and the next and the next. The cold was a patient teacher and he was learning its lesson well. Endure, remain, stand. The wind whispered across the metal roof of the car, a sibilant hiss that sounded like a secret being told to the night. S-H-H-H-H. S-H-H-H-H. The world was hushing him, lulling him, quieting the beat of his heart to match the slow, frozen rhythm of the land. The rivets on the steel strap of the wagon door caught the light. They were round, smooth, and cold. He counted them again, a mental rosary. 1, 2, 3, iron beads on a wooden string. They held the door shut. They held the gold in. They held the darkness out. He focused on the third rivet from the top. It had a small scratch on it, a bright line of raw metal where something had scraped it. Maybe a loading crane, maybe a tool. It was a scar on the metal. A memory of violence in a peaceful, frozen world. He stared at the scratch, letting it fill his vision, letting it become the entire world. A silver line in a universe of gray. The air around him was still now, the gust having passed. The stillness was absolute. It felt as if the world had stopped turning, as if he were the last living thing standing on the edge of the universe, guarding a box of yellow metal that no longer meant anything to anyone. He was a sentinel of the void, a watcher of the ice, and he was cold, so very, very cold, but he stood, and the train stood with him, two dark shapes in the white night, waiting. Always waiting. The stillness of the Siberian night was not an absence of activity, but a physical force, a heavy blanket of dormancy that pressed down upon the earth with the weight of centuries. The air had ceased to be a gas. It had thickened into a medium more akin to water or glass, a transparent solid through which the guard had to push his body with deliberate, slow movements. The temperature had dropped further, sliding down the scale into a realm where numbers lost their meaning, where the difference between 40 and 50 degrees of frost was indistinguishable to the human senses. There was only the absolute, biting reality of the freeze, a condition that seemed to stop time itself, preserving the train and the man in a snapshot of dark blue and charcoal gray. The train car, the 31st in the long, serpentine line, loomed beside him like a cliff face of hewn timber. The wood, once brown and vibrant with the sap of the forest, was now petrified by the cold. It had turned a deep, slate color, the grain raised and hardened into ridges that caught the faint light of the lantern. In the valleys between the grain, minute crystals of ice had formed, glittering like diamond dust in the gloom. The wood was no longer organic. It had been mineralized by the winter, transformed into a substance as hard and unyielding as the iron rails beneath it. The guard ran his gloved hand along the side of the wagon, feeling the roughness of the planks through the thick wool of his mitten. The sensation was dull, distant, a vibration rather than a touch, but it grounded him. It confirmed that the train was real, that he was real, that they were both anchored in this sea of white. He looked at the iron strapping that reinforced the corners of the wagon. The metal was black, coated in a dull patina of oxidation and frost. Where the bolts passed through the wood, the metal had contracted, pulling tight against the timber with a force that must have been immense. He imagined the molecular struggle happening within the materials, the atoms slowing down, huddled together against the void, shrinking, hardening. The train was a monument to tension, a static battle between the structure of the machine and the entropy of the cold. Occasionally, the metal would surrender a fraction of a millimeter, releasing a sharp, cracking sound that echoed down the line like a rifle shot. Crack. Then silence. The silence rushed back in to fill the space left by the sound, heavier and more profound than before. The lantern at his feet was a small, defiant island of warmth in an ocean of freezing darkness. The flame was steady now, a small tongue of orange fire that lived behind the soot-streaked glass. It cast long, distorted shadows across the snow, shadows that did not move but seemed to breathe with the flickering light. The snow within the circle of illumination was not white, but a bruised shade of yellow-gray, the texture rough and granular. It looked like crushed parchment, or the surface of a stale loaf of bread. Beyond the ring of light, the world dissolved into the deep, impenetrable blue of the taiga night. There was no horizon, only a gradient of darkness that swallowed the trees and the sky alike. The guard adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. The movement was slow, a shifting of tectonic plates within the layers of his clothing. The leather sling was stiff, frozen into a permanent loop, and it creaked loudly against the wool of his greatcoat. The sound was dry like old paper tearing. He felt the weight of the weapon, a solid bar of steel and wood that pulled him down towards the earth. The Masin Nagant was a tool of war, designed for the heat of battle, for the rapid movements of men in conflict. Here it was a burden, a ceremonial object. There was nothing to shoot. The enemy was the air, and you could not shoot the wind. You could only endure it. He breathed in, feeling the air enter his nose like a physical intrusion. It was dry, incredibly dry, sucking the moisture from his mucous membranes instantly. It tasted of nothing, clean, sterile, empty. It was the taste of vacuum. As he exhaled, the moisture from his lungs rushed out to meet the cold, condensing instantly into a thick white fog. The cloud hung in front of his face for a moment, a personal nebula, before drifting slowly upward to join the ice haze that shrouded the stars. His scarf was a mask of ice now, a rigid shell that encased his lower face. The wool had frozen into a solid block, shaped by the contours of his jaw and chin. It was uncomfortable, a constant friction against his skin, but it was also a barrier. It trapped a layer of warm, humid air next to his mouth, a small microclimate of survival. Inside the wagon, the gold waited. He thought of the crates again, stacking them in his mind. The wood of the boxes would be smooth, planed, and sanded, unlike the rough exterior of the train car. The metal bands would be shiny, perhaps, or painted black. And inside the bars, the heavy yellow ingots. He tried to visualize the color gold. It was a warm color, the color of the sun, the color of fire. But here in the dark, he could not truly see it. In his mind's eye, the gold was cold. It was pale like the moon. It was hard like the ice. It radiated a chill that seeped through the wood of the crates, through the floor of the wagon, down into the tracks. The gold was a heat sink, absorbing the warmth of the world, hoarding the cold just as it hoarded value. He shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. The snow beneath his boot crunched, a crisp, sharp sound that was swallowed immediately. The sensation in his feet was a dull throb, a reminder of the blood's struggle to reach the extremities. The Valenki were doing their work, holding the worst of the frost at bay, but the cold was patient. It probed for weaknesses, for a gap in the felt, a thin spot in the sock. He wiggled his toes, a rhythmic contraction. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted the movements, focusing his entire consciousness on the distant sensation of his own toes. They were there. They were alive. It was a small victory. The wind began to rise again, a low moan that started in the distance and swept across the steppe. It did not buffet him violently. Rather, it flowed around him, finding the path of least resistance. It was a fluid stream of air, heavy and dense. He could feel the pressure of it against his chest, against his legs. It carried with it a fine powder of snow, ice crystals that were more like dust than flakes. They struck his coat with a soft, hissing sound, finding purchase in the rough weave of the wool. He looked down at his sleeve. The gray fabric was coated in a fine layer of white, a frosting of rime that made him look like a statue carved from stone. He did not brush it off. To move his arm was to spend energy. To spend energy was to lose heat. He let the snow accumulate, becoming part of the landscape. He looked up toward the engine, far ahead in the gloom. He could see nothing but the dark shapes of the intervening cars, a receding line of blocks, but he could hear the locomotive. It was a living thing, breathing in its sleep. The rhythmic chuff, chuff, of the air pump, the occasional hiss of steam escaping a valve. These were the sounds of the machine's heartbeat, slow and lethargic. The engine was keeping itself alive, burning just enough coal to prevent its blood, the water in the boiler from freezing. It was a tenuous existence, a balance between the fire in the box and the ice outside. The guard felt a strange kinship with the machine. They were both burning fuel to stay warm, both waiting for the signal to move, both trapped in the stasis of the winter. Behind the train, the tracks disappeared into the void. The rails were two lines of faint gray, reflecting the starlight where the wind had swept them clear of snow. They looked fragile, thin ribbons of metal laid across the vast, indifferent body of the earth. The sleepers were invisible, buried under the white pack. The train seemed to float, untethered, a ship on a frozen ocean. The sense of isolation was absolute. There were no lights on the horizon, no distant fires, no other trains. There was only this train, this track, this moment. The rest of the world, the cities, the wars, the people, had ceased to exist. They were stories, memories, dreams. The reality was the ice. He closed his eyes and the visual world vanished, leaving only the auditory and the tactile. The wind sounded like a continuous, soft exhalation. Whoosh, whoosh. It was the sound of the planet breathing. He felt the cold on his cheeks, the only part of him exposed to the air. It was a tightening sensation, the skin shrinking, pulling taut over the bone. He felt the weight of his eyelids, heavy and thick. It would be easy to sleep. To just let the knees unlock, to sink down into the snow, to curl up against the wheel of the wagon. The snow would be soft. The wind would cover him. He would be warm eventually. The thought was seductive, a siren song of the hypothermic mind. He recognized it for what it was, a danger signal. He snapped his eyes open. He forced himself to look at the rivets on the wagon door again. He counted them backward this time. 10, 9, 8. They were still there. They were still cold. The mental exercise was a lifeline, a rope that pulled him back from the edge of the sleep. 7, 6, 5. He focused on the texture of the metal, the way the frost clung to the rounded heads of the rivets. 4, 3, 2, 1. He was awake. He was standing. He was the guard. A piece of ice, dislodged from the roof of the car by the wind, fell and struck the lantern. Tink. The sound was tiny, musical, a delicate chime in the heavy silence. The guard looked down. The shard of ice lay on the snow near his boot, catching the light. It was clear as glass, a jagged fragment of frozen water. He stared at it. It was beautiful in a cruel, sharp way. It looked like a jewel, like a piece of the treasure he was guarding. But it was just water. Everything here was just water in one form or another. The snow, the ice, the fog, the breath. It was a world made of water, frozen into a stillness that mocked the fluidity of life. He shifted his grip on the rifle, moving his hands to a new position on the stock to keep the blood flowing. The wood of the rifle was smooth, polished by years of handling. It felt dead in his hands, a cold, inert object. He wondered who had held it before him. Another soldier, perhaps, in another winter on another front. Did he feel the cold like this? Did he stand in the dark and watch the snow fall? The rifle had no memory. It only had weight. It was an object of the present, existing only in the now. The sky above began to shift subtly. The heavy cloud layer that had obscured the stars was thinning, torn apart by the high-altitude winds. Through the ragged gaps in the gray, the true sky was revealed. It was black, a deep, velvety void that seemed to go on forever, and in that blackness the stars burned. They were not the soft, twinkling stars of a summer night. They were hard, fierce points of white light, diamond-hard and incredibly distant. They looked cold. They looked as if they were made of ice themselves, burning with a frozen fire. The guard tilted his head back, cracking the ice on his collar to look at them. The Great Bear hung low over the northern horizon, a familiar shape in an alien sky. It offered no comfort, only a sense of scale. The universe was vast and he was small. The train was a speck of dust. The gold was nothing. He lowered his gaze back to the snow. The vertigo of the stars was too much. It was better to look at the ground, at the known world of the track and the drift. The lantern light was dimming slightly. The wick needed trimming or the oil was thickening. He reached down, his movements stiff and clumsy in the thick coat, and adjusted the knob on the side of the lantern. The flame flared up for a second, then settled back down, burning with a renewed, steady orange glow. The shadows on the snow jumped and resettled. The world was restored to its dim, warm-hued visibility. He thought of hunger. It was a dull ache in the center of his body, a hollow space that seemed to be filled with cold air. He remembered the last meal, a piece of dark, dense bread and a tin of fish. The fish had been salty, oily, cold. The bread had been hard, requiring effort to chew. He savored the memory of the texture, the resistance of the crust against his teeth. It was a sensation of life, of consumption. Now there was nothing to consume but the air. He swallowed, his throat dry and clicking. The act of swallowing was loud in his own ears. Gulp. It emphasized the emptiness. The train settled again, a deep, resonating thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. It was the sound of the entire convoy sinking deeper into its frozen bed. The wheels were cooling, the axles were contracting, the grease was hardening. The train was becoming less of a vehicle and more of a structure, a permanent feature of the landscape. Soon, it would be impossible to move. The ice would weld the wheels to the rails, the snow would drift over the couplings, and the train would be part of the geology of Siberia. The guard imagined the archaeologists of the future finding it, digging through the ice to find the wooden cars, the gold and the guard, standing at his post, preserved in the permafrost. He walked his small patrol again, 3 steps left, turn, 3 steps right, turn. The rhythm was hypnotic. Crunch, 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 turn, crunch, 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 turn. It was a dance of survival, a minimal choreography designed to keep the engine of the body running. He watched his shadow stretch and shrink as he moved relative to the lantern. The shadow was a dark, shapeless giant that mimicked his movements, a silent partner in the dance. The snow in the shadow was blue. The snow in the light was yellow. Blue, yellow, the colors of the night. The wind sighed through the gap between his wagon and the next. It was a mournful sound, a low whistle that rose and fell with the gusts. It sounded like a voice, unintelligible and sad. Ooh, ooh, the voice of the steppe. It was telling a story of distance and cold, a story that had no beginning and no end. The guard listened, letting the sound wash over him. He was a captive audience. He had nowhere else to go. He was the listener in the dark. He leaned against the wagon again, feeling the solid, flat resistance of the wood. It was a wall at his back, a defense against the wind that came from the north. He tucked his chin down, burying his nose in the frozen scarf. He closed his eyes to slits, watching the world through the screen of his eyelashes. The rime on his lashes diffracted the lantern light, turning the single flame into a starburst of orange streaks. It was a trick of the eye, a hallucination of warmth. He focused on it, letting the orange fill his vision. Orange was the color of heat. Orange was the color of life. He held onto the color, wrapping it around his mind like a blanket. But the blue was stronger. The blue of the shadows, the blue of the ice, the blue of the night. It seeped in from the edges, cooling the orange, turning it gray. The cold was a tide that never went out. It only rose inch by inch, minute by minute. The guard stood his ground. He was the breakwater. He was the stone. He did not move. He did not speak. He only waited. The gold behind him was silent. The train was silent. The night was silent. And in that silence, the cold reigned supreme, the undisputed Tsar of the Siberian plain. The rivets on the strap. 1, 2, 3. He counted them again. It was time to count. It was time to stand. The night was still young. The dawn was a rumor. The cold was the truth. He breathed in. He breathed out. The cloud of his breath drifted away, a white ghost entering the darkness, leaving him alone once more with the weight of the gold and the weight of the winter. The night did not advance in hours or minutes, but in layers of accumulated frost. It was a slow, geological thickening of the atmosphere, a sedimentation of cold that buried the world in silence. The guard stood at the center of this accumulation, a solitary figure anchored to the frozen earth by the weight of his duty and the heaviness of his greatcoat. The wind had changed its voice again, dropping from a hollow whistle to a low, barely audible hum that vibrated against the wooden slats of the train car. It was a sound that seemed to come from under the snow, a subterranean murmur of the sleeping steppe. The air was no longer just cold. It was dense, a medium that resisted movement, a transparent fluid that had begun to coagulate around the motionless train. He looked down at his boots. The Valenki were gray, felted wool that had lost all definition of shape. They were simply blocks of insulation, dark and heavy against the pale, bruised blue of the snow. Around the base of the boots, a small drift had formed, a curved ramp of white powder that connected his feet to the ground. He was becoming rooted. The snow was claiming him, integrating him into the landscape. He wiggled his toes, a slow, deliberate flexion inside the felt. The sensation was distant, as if he were operating a machine by remote control. There was a dull resistance, a stiffness in the wool that spoke of the freezing moisture trapped within the layers. Push, release, push, release. It was a binary code of survival, a signal sent from the brain to the extremities. I am here. I am still here. The lantern light flickered, casting a sudden, sharp shadow against the side of the wagon. The flame was struggling against a draft that had found its way through the ventilation holes of the casing. The shadow of the guard's legs stretched out long and distorted, bending where the snow drift rose and fell. It looked like the legs of a giant or a broken tree stump. He watched the shadow dance, a jerky, nervous movement that contrasted with his own stillness. The light revealed the texture of the snow in microscopic detail. It was not a uniform surface. It was a chaotic landscape of ridges, valleys, and plateaus, all formed by the wind. There were tiny, glittering facets where individual crystals caught the light, flashing with a momentary, cold brilliance before the angle changed and they went dark again. He turned his head slowly to the left, the wool of his collar grinding against the scarf. The sound was loud, a dry crunching that resonated in his skull. He looked at the coupling between his wagon and the next. It was a heavy iron linkage, a hook and loop that connected the two vehicles. The metal was black, coated in a thick, fuzzy layer of hoarfrost that made it look like it was covered in white mold. The grease that had once lubricated the joint was now a solid, amber-colored resin, frozen into a hard droplet that hung suspended from the bolt. The coupling was under tension, pulled taut by the contraction of the train in the cold. It looked fragile, as if a sudden jar might snap the iron like glass. But nothing moved. The train was a single, fused entity, a spine of frozen metal stretching across the continent. The air smelled of ozone and ice. It was a sharp, metallic scent that stung the inside of his nose. There was no smell of organic life, no pine, no earth, no decay. Those smells were locked away under the snow, sealed in the vault of the winter. There was only the smell of the cold itself, a pure chemical odor that was the absence of everything else. He breathed it in, feeling the chill travel down his throat, cooling his lungs from the inside. It was a process of internal refrigeration. With every breath, he was bringing the winter into his body, letting it circulate in his blood. He imagined his blood turning blue, thickening, slowing down until it matched the sluggish viscosity of the oil in the wheel bearings. He shifted his weight again, leaning his shoulder against the rough wood of the wagon. The timber was hard, unyielding. It did not offer comfort, only support. He could feel the cold radiating from the gold inside the car, through the wood, through his coat to his skin. It was a specific kind of cold, heavy, dense, metallic. The gold was a battery that had been charging in the Siberian winter for weeks, storing up the frost. Now it was discharging it, a silent field of freezing energy that surrounded the train. He wondered if the gold was changing physically, if the atoms were packing closer together, making the bars smaller, denser, harder. Gold was supposed to be soft, malleable, but here everything became hard. Softness was a weakness that the winter did not tolerate. A sudden gust of wind rattled the sliding door of the wagon. Clack, clack. The sound was sharp, wooden, mechanical. It was the only part of the train that seemed to have any looseness left. The door was locked, sealed with a heavy iron padlock that hung down like a dead weight. The padlock was coated in ice, the keyhole completely blocked by a plug of white frost. Even if he had the key, he doubted he could open it. The mechanism would be seized, the tumblers frozen solid. The gold was safe not because of the lock, but because the lock had become a solid block of metal. The entire train was a lock. The landscape was the key, and the key was lost in the snow. He looked up at the sky. The hole in the clouds had widened, revealing a vast stretch of the cosmos. The Milky Way was a faint, bruised smear of light across the blackness, a river of diamond dust that mirrored the snow on the ground. The stars were hard and bright, pinpricks of intense white light that did not twinkle. They stared down with a steady, unblinking gaze. He felt exposed under their scrutiny. They were eyes of the void, watching the small, warm creature huddled against the train. He felt a sense of vertigo, a feeling that gravity might fail, and he would fall upwards into that deep, cold well of stars. He looked down quickly, grounding himself on the visual anchor of the lantern. The lantern was his sun. It was a small, captive star that obeyed his will, or at least the will of the wick and the oil. The glass was getting dirtier, the soot building up in the corners, narrowing the beam of light. He should clean it, but that would mean taking off a mitten, opening the casing, exposing his skin to the air. It was not worth the risk. The light was enough. It showed him his boots. It showed him the snow. It showed him the iron wheel. That was his world. Anything beyond that was conjecture. The darkness beyond the light was absolute. It was a wall of black velvet that absorbed everything. He listened to the silence. It was not empty. It was full of high-pitched frequencies, the ringing in his ears that came from the absence of sound. It was a thin, whistling tone like the sound of a wet finger on the rim of a crystal glass. Ee. It was the sound of his own nervous system, amplified by the isolation. He tried to tune it out to focus on the external sounds. The wind, whoosh. The settling of the snow, crump. The groan of the wood, creak. These were the real sounds. The other was just the song of the mind, spinning in neutral. He thought about the concept of waiting. He had been waiting for hours, or was it days? The concept of time was fluid here. There was no clock, only the slow turning of the earth. Waiting implied an expectation of an event, arrival, departure, change. But here there was no expectation. There was only the state of being. He was not waiting for the train to move. He was simply existing with the train. The train was a part of the geography, and he was a part of the train. He was a gargoyle on a cathedral of wood and iron placed there to ward off. What? There were no spirits here, only the wind. His hands were cold. Even inside the sheepskin mittens, the tips of his fingers were numb. He pulled his hands out of the mittens, keeping them inside the sleeves of his greatcoat, and made fists. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. He rubbed his knuckles together, bone against bone, generating a tiny friction. The skin of his hands was dry and papery. He could feel the roughness of his own knuckles. He blew warm air down the neck of his coat, trying to capture the heat, but the scarf blocked it. The heat of his breath was for the outside world, a tribute to the winter. He looked at the tracks again. The steel rails were two dark lines, perfectly parallel, etched into the white. They were the definition of order in a chaotic landscape. They went on forever, east and west. To the east, Vladivostok, the ocean, the end of the line. To the west, Omsk, Moscow, the past. He was standing in the middle, in the nowhere. The rails were covered in a thin film of ice, a glazing that made them look slippery and dangerous. If he were to touch his tongue to the rail, a childhood thought that surfaced absurdly, he would be stuck fast. The metal would bond to the flesh instantly. The train was a trap. The rails were the jaws. He watched a small eddy of wind pick up a spiral of snow dust. It spun like a miniature tornado, a ghost of white energy dancing across the tracks. It moved silently, gracefully over the sleeper, over the rail, and then collapsed back into the drift. It was a moment of pure physics, air and water interacting in the vacuum. It was beautiful and meaningless. He watched another one form further down the line. The wind was playing with the snow, sculpting it, moving it, erasing it. The landscape was in a constant state of slow motion flux. Nothing was permanent except the cold. The guard's eyes felt heavy. The lids were weighted with ice, the lashes thick with rime. He blinked, a slow, deliberate shuddering of the view. Dark, light, dark, light. When his eyes were closed, he saw afterimages of the lantern flame, bright orange spots floating in the black. They drifted and faded, turning green, then blue, then vanishing. He forced his eyes open. He had to keep looking. Looking was his job. If he stopped looking, he might stop being. He focused on the texture of the greatcoat sleeve. The wool was gray, a mix of dark and light fibers woven together. It was coarse, scratchy looking. In the folds of the elbow, snow had gathered in the creases, compacted into white lines. It looked like a topographical map of a mountainous region. The coat was a landscape in itself. He brushed the snow away with his other mitten. It fell in a small cascade, landing on his boots. The wool underneath was dark and damp. The snow had melted slightly from his body heat, then refrozen. The coat was an armor of ice-impregnated wool. He thought of the locomotive crew. They were probably asleep or staring into the firebox. The firebox, a cavern of red coals pulsating with heat. He imagined standing next to it, the heat hitting his face like a physical blow. The smell of burning coal, sulfur, and carbon, the hiss of the water. It seemed like a dream of another life. Here there was no fire. Only the lantern, a tiny spark that emphasized the darkness. The distance between him and the engine felt infinite. 100 yards. 200. It might as well be on the moon. The wind shifted again, coming now from the east. It brought a slightly different scent, or maybe he imagined it, a smell of emptiness. No, it was just the same cold, recycled and blown back. The temperature seemed to drop another degree. He could feel it in his knees, a tightening of the tendons. The fluid in his joints was thickening. To move required hydraulic pressure. He lifted one leg, stamped it. Thump. The sound was duller than before. The snow was packing harder. The platform he stood on was becoming ice. He looked at the number painted on the side of the wagon. 31. The paint was white, peeling and cracked. The 3 was faded at the top. The 1 was just a vertical slash. 31, it was just a number, it meant nothing. It was the 31st box of gold. How much gold? Tons, poods, a meaningless quantity. It was heavy. That was all that mattered. It made the train heavy. It made the earth heavy. He leaned his head back against the wood, the back of his fur hat cushioning the contact. The hat was warm. A thick layer of sheepskin that protected his ears and skull. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a whoosh-whoosh sound that synchronized with his heart. It was a slow rhythm. Bump, 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 slow and steady. A hibernation rhythm the body knew. The body was shutting down unnecessary systems. Digestion stopped. Higher thought slowing, memory fading. Only the core remained. Keep the heart beating. Keep the lungs pumping, stand. He watched the shadows of the wheel spokes on the snow. They were thick bars of darkness radiating from the hub. As the lantern swung slightly in a gust, the shadows swung too, like the hands of a clock moving back and forth. Tick-tock, tick-tock, but time did not advance. It just oscillated. The train was trapped in a loop of time, a frozen moment that stretched out endlessly. He tried to remember the face of someone, anyone, a woman, a mother, a comrade. The images were blurry, washed out like an old photograph left in the sun. He couldn't recall the specific features, just a sense of warmth, a vague outline of a smile. The cold had erased the details. The cold erased everything eventually. It smoothed out the rough edges of memory just as the snow smoothed out the rough edges of the land. He took a deep breath, holding it. The air was a block of ice in his chest. He felt the cold spreading from his lungs to his ribs to his spine. It was a clarifying sensation. It woke him up slightly. He exhaled, a long, controlled stream. The cloud was thick, opaque. It swirled around his face before dissipating. He was a dragon breathing smoke in a frozen kingdom, but his fire was gone. He was an ice dragon now. The silence was broken by the sound of a tree cracking deep in the forest. Crack. It was a violent, explosive sound like a bone breaking. It echoed through the taiga, bouncing off the trees, sharp and clear. Then it was gone. The silence rushed back in, healing the wound in the air instantly. The guard did not flinch. He just noted it. A tree had died, or a branch had failed. Gravity and ice had won another small victory. He looked at the rivets on the wagon again. He decided to count them by row. Top row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Middle row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bottom row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 15 rivets, 15 points of iron. They were symmetrical, orderly. He liked them. They made sense. They didn't change. He stared at the center rivet of the middle row. It was the center of his universe. If he stared at it long enough, the rest of the world disappeared. There was only the rivet. The gray, frozen rivet. A sensation of numbness began to creep up his shins. It was not painful. It was simply a loss of data. His legs were ceasing to report their status to his brain. He needed to move. He forced himself to push away from the wagon. The movement was stiff. He walked 3 steps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound proved he was still solid. He turned 3 steps back. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He resumed his position. The blood moved slightly. The data returned, a dull ache. Pain was good. Pain meant life. Numbness was the enemy. He adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder. It had slipped slightly. He hitched it up, the leather creaking. The weight of the gun was familiar, a part of his anatomy. He didn't feel the gun, he felt the weight of it. It was a ballast keeping him upright. Without it, he might float away into the snow. The gun, the coat, the boots, they were his anchors. He looked at the horizon again. It was still dark, no sign of dawn. The night was a long tunnel and he was in the middle of it. There was no light at the end, only the lantern at his feet. He looked at the lantern. The flame was a small, brave thing. He felt a surge of affection for it. It was his only friend, his only source of color. It was fighting the same battle he was, the battle against the blue, the battle against the gray. He stood, he waited. The wind hummed, the snow sparkled, the train slept, the gold slept. The world was a drawing in charcoal and chalk, and he was a smudge of graphite on the paper waiting for the artist to turn the page. But the page did not turn. The book remained open. The story remained paused. And the cold continued its slow, silent work, turning everything to stone. He breathed in. The air was sharp. He breathed out. The fog was thick. He was the guard. He was the watcher. He was the ice. The rhythm continued. In, out, stand, wait. The night was eternal. The cold was absolute. The silence was the only truth. The wind had sculpted the world into a new shape during the long, indeterminate hours of the watch. It had ceased to be a chaotic force and had become a meticulous artist, working with a palette of white and gray to smooth over the rough edges of reality. The snow was no longer falling from the sky. It was being rearranged, lifted from the drifts and plastered against the windward side of the train in hard, compact sheets. The train was losing its definition. The sharp angles of the boxcars, the intricate machinery of the undercarriages, the gaps between the wagons, all were being softened, filled in, and erased by the relentless accumulation of the drift. The train was becoming a geological feature, a long, low ridge of snow-covered iron that stretched across the plain like the spine of a buried dragon. The guard stood amidst this transformation, a witness to the slow erasure of the man-made world. He felt the snow piling up against his shins, a rising tide of cold powder that had now breached the tops of his Valenki boots. He did not brush it away. To do so would be a futile gesture, an argument with the wind that he could not win. The snow was a blanket, a layer of insulation that, while cold in itself, protected the felt of his boots from the biting wind. He accepted the burial. He accepted the weight. He felt like a post driven into the ground, a marker for a boundary that no longer existed. He looked at the axle box of the nearest wheel set. It was a heavy cast-iron housing, square and brutal, designed to contain the journal bearing and the oil that kept the train rolling. Now it was a block of ice. The lid of the box, hinged at the top, was sealed shut by a thick rim of frost. The oil inside, usually a viscous liquid, would be a solid mass of amber jelly, stiff and unyielding. The heat of friction that usually kept the box warm was a distant memory. The metal was dead. It radiated a profound chill that he could feel even from 2 paces away. The axle box was the heart of the wheel's movement, and the heart had stopped beating. It was a silent, frozen organ in the anatomy of the train. The lantern light caught the texture of the iron wheel spokes. They were thick, structural beams radiating from the hub, painted black but now coated in a fine, fuzzy layer of hoarfrost. The frost crystals grew outward from the metal, defying gravity, forming delicate, fern-like structures that shivered slightly in the wind. They were incredibly fragile, yet they survived because the air was so still, so heavy. The guard stared at one particular cluster of crystals on the lower spoke. It looked like a miniature forest of white pine trees, growing upside down on a planet of iron. He marveled at the complexity of it. In a world of such brutality, the physics of water and cold created structures of impossible delicacy. He breathed in a slow, measured intake of the vacuum-like air. The sensation was familiar now, a dull ache in the sinuses, a cooling of the throat. The air tasted of nothing, no smoke, no earth, no life. It was the taste of interstellar space. He held the breath, letting the oxygen seep into his blood, knowing that with every second he held it, he was preserving a fraction of a calorie of heat. Then he exhaled. The cloud that emerged was dense and heavy. It did not dissipate quickly. It hung in front of his face, a gray ghost that obscured his vision for a moment before drifting slowly to the right, carried by the subtle current of the air. He watched it go, a piece of himself leaving to join the atmosphere. The scarf around his face had become a solid architecture of ice. The wool fibers were glued together by the frozen moisture of his breath, forming a hard, curved shell that stood away from his skin. It was no longer soft. It was a helmet, a rigid mask that restricted the movement of his jaw. Inside this mask, the air was humid and slightly warmer, a tiny, personal tropical zone in the Arctic night. He could smell the wet wool, a scent that was both comforting and suffocating. It was the smell of the sheep, the smell of the loom, the smell of the damp earth where the wool had once been sheared. It was a connection to a living world that seemed millions of miles away. He shifted the weight of the rifle. The strap had dug a groove into the shoulder of his greatcoat, compressing the heavy wool. He lifted the weapon slightly, easing the pressure, and let it settle back into a slightly different position. The movement was small, barely visible, but to him it was a significant event. It changed the balance of his body. It shifted the center of gravity. The rifle was heavy, a dead weight of wood and steel. The metal parts, the barrel, the bolt handle, the trigger guard, were matte with frost. They looked like they had been dipped in sugar. He knew that if he were to touch the bare metal with his ungloved hand, the skin would burn and stick. The rifle was dangerous not because it could fire a bullet, but because it was a conductor of the cold. The darkness beyond the lantern's reach was absolute. It was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical substance, a heavy, velvet curtain that pressed in against the fragile bubble of illumination. The guard felt the pressure of the dark on his back, on the sides of his vision. It was waiting. It was patient. It knew that the oil in the lantern would eventually run dry, that the wick would burn down to a char, and then the dark would claim the space. It would rush in, filling the void, erasing the wheel, the snow, and the guard. The thought was not frightening. It was simply a calculation, a matter of time. He looked at the side of the wagon again. The wood was a landscape of textures. There were knots in the timber, dark swirls where branches had once grown. These knots were harder than the surrounding wood, raised slightly by the weathering of the grain. They looked like dark eyes staring out from the planks, eyes that had seen the forests of the West, the sawmills, the rail yards, and now the empty steppe. They were blind, wooden eyes, witnessing the silent passage of the night. He traced the grain of the wood with his eyes, following the undulating lines of the growth rings. Each line was a year in the life of a tree, a summer of sun, a winter of snow. The history of the tree was written on the side of the gold train. The gold itself, hidden behind the walls, was a constant presence in his mind. He imagined the bars again, smooth, cold, yellow. They were stacked in their crates, wrapped in oilcloth or straw. They were heavy. Density was their defining characteristic. Gold was dense. Lead was dense. The cold was dense. It felt as if the gold was generating its own gravity, pulling the train down, pulling the guard down, anchoring them to the core of the earth. The wealth of the empire was not a symbol of power here. It was a geological fact. It was a vein of metal that had been mined, refined, and then returned to the earth in a wooden box. It was sleeping. It was waiting for a future that might never come. A sound echoed from far down the line. Clang. It was the sound of a buffer compressing, metal striking metal. The train was settling. The temperature had dropped another degree and the steel was shrinking. The sound was lonely, sharp, and mournful. It traveled through the rail, through the wheels, through the ground, and up through the soles of his boots. He felt the vibration before he heard the sound. It was a tremor in the earth, a message from the locomotive. We are still here. We are still heavy. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It rushed back in to fill the hole the sound had made, smoothing over the disturbance like water over a stone. He looked at his mittens. They were large, shapeless paws of sheepskin, the leather cracked and worn, the fur inside matted down. They were the only things keeping his fingers from freezing solid. He curled his fingers inside the mittens, making a fist. The leather resisted. It was stiff with cold. He could feel the texture of the inside of the mitten, the rough hide against his knuckles. He rubbed his thumb against the side of his index finger, creating a tiny amount of friction. It was a private spark of heat, a secret fire that only he knew about. He did it again. Rub, rub, rub. It was a rhythm, a tiny heartbeat in the hand. The snow at his feet was a study in blue. The light from the lantern was warm yellow-orange, but the shadows were deep indigo blue. The transition between the light and the dark was a gradient of color that moved from amber to slate to black. The snow crystals in the transition zone sparkled with a dual nature, reflecting the fire on one facet and the night on another. He stared at a single crystal that lay on the toe cap of his boot. It was a prism. It took the lantern light and broke it into a tiny spectrum, a microscopic rainbow in the middle of the desolation. He watched it until his eyes watered from the strain, the moisture blurring the image into a starburst. He thought of the concept of east. The train was facing east, towards the sunrise, but there was no sunrise. There was only the night. East was a direction on a map, an abstract idea. Here, there was only here. The present location was the only reality. The rest of the world was a memory or a dream. He tried to remember the map of Russia, the vast, sprawling shape of the country, the pink and green shapes of the provinces, the blue lines of the rivers, the black dots of the cities. It all seemed so small, so manageable on paper, but out here the scale was terrifying. The land went on forever. The snow went on forever. The train was a splinter in the hide of a sleeping giant. He leaned back against the wagon, letting the wood take his weight. His legs were tired. The muscles in his thighs were tight, burning with a low-level fatigue. The cold had seeped into his joints, making the synovial fluid thick and sluggish. He felt like an old man, though he was young. The winter aged everything. It weathered the wood, rusted the iron, and aged the man. He felt the hardness of the wagon wall through his coat. It was a solid, reassuring pressure. It told him he was not floating. He was grounded. He was supported. The wind picked up a handful of snow and threw it against the lantern. Hiss. The crystals hit the hot glass and vaporized instantly. A tiny puff of steam rose and vanished. The flame flickered, startled by the intrusion, then steadied itself. The guard watched the interplay of elements: fire, water, air, earth. They were all here, interacting in their rawest forms. The lantern was the fire. The snow was the water. The wind was the air. The train was the earth, iron, and wood dug from the ground. He was the fifth element, the observer, the consciousness that gave the scene meaning. Without him, the wind would just blow, the snow would just fall, and the gold would just sit. He was necessary. Closed his eyes for a long count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The darkness behind his eyelids was filled with swirling patterns of phosphorescence, the residual noise of the optic nerve. He saw spirals of green and purple drifting like smoke. He listened to the wind. It sounded like a river flowing over stones, a continuous rushing sound that smoothed out the silence. It was a lullaby. Sleep, it whispered, sleep. It is warm under the snow. It is quiet under the snow. He recognized the voice. It was the voice of the hypothermia, the seductress of the north. He opened his eyes. Snap. The visual world returned. The yellow light, the blue snow, the black wheel. He was awake. He was alive. He looked at the tracks again. The rails were almost gone now. The drift had risen to the level of the railhead. Only a faint, dark line marked where the steel ran. The train was losing its connection to the ground. It looked like it was floating on a cloud of white. The ties were long gone, buried deep under the pack. The ballast, the gravel, the earth, all hidden. The world was simplifying. Soon, there would be only the train and the snow. The complexity of the railway engineering was being erased by the simplicity of the winter. He felt a shiver start at the base of his spine. It was a small tremor, a ripple of muscle contraction. He let it happen. It was the body's way of generating heat. The shiver traveled up his back, across his shoulders, and down his arms. His teeth chattered once. Click. Then he clamped his jaw shut. He would not let the cold win. He tightened his core muscles, forcing the warmth to stay in the center. He visualized his heart as a furnace, a cast-iron stove burning bright red coal. He fed the fire with his will. Burn, burn, burn. The shiver subsided. The air around the lantern seemed to thicken. The light was struggling to push through the density of the cold. The halo around the flame was smaller, tighter. The shadows were sharper. The contrast was increasing. It was a world of high contrast, bright light, deep dark, no middle ground. The drawing was being inked over with heavy black lines. The guard felt like a sketch himself, a figure drawn in charcoal on a rough, gray paper. He was smudged, indistinct, fading into the background. He looked at the lock on the wagon door. The padlock was a heavy, iron lump. It hung from the hasp, motionless. A long icicle had formed on the bottom of the lock, a clear dagger of ice pointing at the ground. It was perfect, tapered, sharp. He had an urge to break it off, to snap the ice and hear the sound, crack. But he didn't. He let it be. It was part of the train now, part of the decoration. The train was bedecked in jewels of ice. It was a treasure train after all. It deserved to be decorated. The silence stretched out, thin and taut like a wire. He waited for it to break. He waited for a wolf to howl, for a tree to snap, for the engine to whistle. But there was nothing, just the wind, the eternal, relentless wind. It blew from the north, carrying the chill of the polar ice cap. It blew across the tundra, across the taiga, across the steppe. It found the train, it found the guard. It passed through them and continued south. They were just obstacles in its path, stones in the stream. He adjusted his feet again. Shuffle, shuffle. The snow squeaked, high-pitched, dry, like styrofoam rubbing together. The sound was irritating, grating. It was a sound of extreme cold. Wet snow didn't squeak. Only dry, frozen snow squeaked. It was the voice of the frost. He wiggled his toes. They were still there. Numb but present, he focused on the big toe of his right foot. He commanded it to move. It moved. He felt the fabric of the sock slide against the skin. Good. The connection was still valid. The telegraph line to the foot was open. He looked up at the sky. The hole in the clouds had closed. The gray ceiling had returned. The stars were gone. The universe had shrunk back down to the immediate vicinity. There was no cosmos. There was only the cloud layer and the snow. The lid was back on the box. The pressure increased. The air felt heavier. It pressed down on his shoulders, on his hat. He felt like Atlas holding up the sky, but the sky was made of ice. He thought of the tea again. The memory was fading. It was hard to recall the taste. The heat was a ghost. He tried to replace it with a new thought, fire, a bonfire. He imagined a pile of birch logs, the white bark curling and blackening as the flames licked up, the crackle of the wood, the sparks flying up into the night, the radiant heat hitting his face, melting the ice on his scarf. He built the fire in his mind, log by log. He struck the match. He watched it catch. The yellow flame, the blue smoke. It was a beautiful hallucination. He warmed his hands at the mental fire. He stood in the snow, freezing, warming his soul at a fire that did not exist. The train creaked, a long, slow groan of wood under stress. The moisture in the planks was expanding as it froze, pushing the fibers apart. The wagon was growing slightly, swelling with the ice. It was a living, breathing thing reacting to the environment. The guard patted the side of the wagon with his mitten. Thump, thump. Quiet now, he whispered. The words were lost in the scarf. Quiet now, sleep. He was talking to the train. He was the nursemaid to a monster of wood and gold. The wind gusted, swirling the snow around his legs. The drift was higher now. It was halfway up his calves. The train was sinking. The world was rising. He was being buried alive very slowly, grain by grain. He didn't mind. It was peaceful. The snow was clean. The snow was pure. The snow was the end of all things. He stood. He watched. He waited. The night was a long, dark river, and he was a stone on the bottom, letting the water flow over him. The gold was the sediment. The train was the wreckage. And the cold was the water, dark and deep and cold. He took another breath. In, out. The rhythm was his clock, the only clock that mattered. 1 breath, 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour. It was all the same. The time was frozen. The history was frozen. The story was frozen. And he was the guard of the ice. The night had entered a phase of absolute stasis. A deep, resonant pause in the rhythm of existence where the only movement was the microscopic growth of ice crystals. The guard stood in the center of this frozen tableau, a figure rendered in heavy strokes of charcoal and slate blue against the backdrop of the endless white. The wind had settled into a low, droning frequency, a sound that was less like air moving and more like the earth humming to itself in a deep sleep. It was a vibration that could be felt in the teeth, a subtle resonance that traveled through the soles of the Valenki boots and up into the bones of the legs. The cold was no longer an external aggressor. It had permeated the boundaries of the world, soaking into the wood of the train, the steel of the rails, and the layers of the guard's clothing until everything shared the same temperature, the same brittle rigidity. He looked at the leaf springs of the train car's suspension. They were stacks of curved steel plates, designed to absorb the shocks of the journey, to cushion the heavy load of the gold. Now, they were compressed flat, the weight of the bullion inside the wagon pushing them down until the metal groaned under the strain. The spaces between the leaves were filled with hard-packed snow and ice, turning the suspension into a solid block. The grease that had once lubricated the sliding surfaces was a dark, frozen paste, as hard as the steel itself. The springs looked like layers of sedimentary rock, a geological formation that had been exposed by the wind. They were cold, incredibly cold. They radiated a chill that seemed to suck the heat out of the air around them, creating a localized zone of intense freezing near the wheels. The guard shifted his weight, a slow, hydraulic movement of his limbs. His knees felt stiff, the joints grinding slightly as if they were filled with sand. He could feel the tendons stretching, tight and dry, resisting the motion. The heavy greatcoat swung slightly with his movement, the stiff wool knocking against his boots with a dull, wooden sound. The coat had become a shell, a personal architecture that he inhabited. The folds of the fabric were frozen in place, sculpted by the wind and the moisture into permanent waves and ridges. Inside the coat, the air was stale and still, a small pocket of warmth that he guarded jealously. He pulled his arms tighter against his chest, hugging the rifle to his body, trying to minimize the surface area exposed to the night. The lantern on the ground was a small, struggling heart. The flame had burned down lower, the wick consuming the oil at a steady, relentless pace. The light was dimmer now, a deep, blood-orange glow that barely reached the wheel of the wagon. The glass chimney was clouded with soot on one side, blocking the light and casting a sharp, angular shadow that stretched out across the snow. The shadow of the wheel spokes looked like the bars of a cage, projected onto the ground. The guard watched the shadow flicker and jump as the flame danced in a draft. It was the only thing in the world that was moving with any speed. The rest of the world was locked in slow motion, a film running at 1 frame per hour. He stared at the texture of the snow in the shadow. It was blue, a deep, rich indigo that seemed to absorb the gaze. The surface was not smooth. It was pitted and scarred by the wind, a miniature landscape of craters and dunes. In the bottom of the tiny craters, the shadows were absolute black, holes in the fabric of reality. He imagined himself shrinking down, walking into one of those blue craters, finding shelter from the wind in the microscopic valleys of the snow. It was a strange thought, a drift of the mind caused by the cold and the fatigue. He shook his head slightly, the fur of his hat brushing against the collar of his coat. Scritch-scratch. The sound was loud in his ears, waking him up from the reverie. The train car loomed above him, a dark wall of vertical planks. The wood was old, seasoned by decades of Russian winters. It had turned a dark, weathered gray, the color of storm clouds. The grain was raised, the soft wood worn away, leaving the hard ridges exposed. He could see the nails that held the planks in place. The heads of the nails were rusted, dark spots against the gray wood, each one capped with a tiny cone of white frost. They looked like buttons on a coat or stars in a dark sky. He counted them again. 1, 2, 3. A constellation of iron. They held the wagon together. They held the gold inside. They held the history of the empire in a wooden box. He thought about the gold. It was a heavy, dense presence in his mind. He tried to visualize the atoms of the gold, packed tightly together, shivering in the cold. Gold was a noble metal. It did not rust. It did not tarnish. It was indifferent to the elements. While the iron of the train corroded and the wood rotted, the gold remained pure, unchanged. It was eternal. And because it was eternal, it was cold. It had no life, no warmth, no decay. It was a dead metal, perfect and sterile. He felt a strange resentment towards it. The gold was safe. It was comfortable in the cold. He was not. He was flesh and blood, a creature of warmth, trapped in a world that wanted to freeze him. The wind shifted again, coming from the northeast now, blowing across the top of the train. It whistled through the brake rigging, a high, thin sound that set his teeth on edge. Shee-yee. It was a sound of tension, of wires being pulled tight. He looked up at the roof of the wagon. He could see the edge of the roof, a dark line against the slightly lighter sky. A cornice of snow hung over the edge, a curved lip of white that looked ready to fall. It was sculpted by the wind into a perfect aerodynamic shape, smooth and sharp. He watched it, waiting for it to break, but it held. The snow was strong. The ice was a glue that bound the world together. His breath was a cloud of crystals. He watched it emerge from his scarf, a thick white plume that swirled in the lantern light. The moisture in his breath froze instantly upon hitting the air, turning into diamond dust. He was exhaling jewels. He was breathing out ice. The scarf was heavy with it. A thick crust of ice had formed on the outside of the wool, a bib of white that cracked when he moved his head. He could feel the cold moisture against his lips, the damp wool freezing to his skin. He pushed his tongue against the inside of his teeth, checking for warmth. It was there, but faint. The fire inside was banking down, conserving fuel. He looked at his hands, encased in the shapeless mittens. They looked like the paws of a bear, large and clumsy. He tried to feel the trigger guard of the rifle through the layers of leather and wool. He could feel the pressure, the hard ridge of the metal, but no texture. The sensation was dull, muffled. He squeezed the mitten, compressing the insulation. The leather creaked. It was stiff, frozen into the shape of his grip. If he took his hand out, the mitten would remain in that shape, a hollow ghost of a hand holding a ghost of a rifle. He kept his hands inside. The air outside was a predator, waiting to bite. The silence of the step was a physical weight. It pressed against his eardrums, a heavy, fluid pressure that made him feel like he was underwater. He swallowed to clear his ears, but the pressure remained. It was the weight of the atmosphere, cooled and condensed, settling on the earth. He felt small, insignificant, a speck of dust on a vast, white sheet. The train was a line of dust. The gold was a pebble. The cold was the only thing that was real. It was the only thing that had agency. The cold moved. The cold acted. The cold claimed. He looked down the length of the train again. The perspective was distorted by the gloom. The wagon seemed to merge into a single, continuous wall, a fortress of wood and shadow. He could not see the end of the train. It faded into the darkness, dissolved by the night. He could not see the beginning. He was in the middle of an infinite line, a line that divided the world into north and south. He was standing on the border, guarding the line. But the line was buried in snow. The border was gone. There was only the white unity of the winter. He felt the cold seeping through the soles of his boots. It was a slow invasion, a creeping numbness that started at the toes and worked its way up. He visualized the cold as a blue dye staining his feet, turning the flesh into wood. He stamped his feet again. Thump, thump. The sound was dull, dead. The snow did not crunch anymore. It was packed too hard. It sounded like striking a sandbag. He did it again. Thump, thump. He needed to feel the impact. He needed to know that his feet were still attached to the earth. The lantern flame flickered violently, then steadied. A drop of water from the melting snow on the casing had fallen into the oil. Sputter. The sound was loud, shocking. He looked down. The flame was smaller now, struggling to recover. He held his breath, willing the fire to live. Come on, he thought. Burn. The flame grew again, turning from blue to yellow to orange. He let out his breath. The light returned, casting the long shadows back onto the snow. He felt a wave of relief that was disproportionate to the event. The lantern was his life. If the light went out, he would be alone in the dark, and the dark was cold. He leaned his head back against the wagon, closing his eyes for a moment. The wood was hard against the back of his skull, even through the fur hat. He felt the vibration of the wind in the wood, a low, constant thrumming. The train was singing a song of endurance. It was a song of atoms holding on, of molecules resisting the urge to stop moving completely. He listened to the song, letting it fill his mind. It was better than the silence. It was a connection to the machine. He was part of the machine now. He was a component, the biological component, the sensor, the watcher. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky. The clouds were lower now, a solid ceiling of gray that reflected the faint light of the snow. There was no moon, no stars, just the heavy, oppressive lid of the atmosphere. The world was a room with no windows, and the walls were closing in. He felt a sense of claustrophobia, a desire to push the sky back up to make room for the air. But the sky was heavy. It pressed down on his shoulders, adding to the weight of the coat, the rifle, the duty. He thought of the engineer in the locomotive. Was he awake? Was he watching the gauges, the pressure of the steam, the level of the water? The engineer lived in a world of dials and levers, a world of control. The guard lived in a world of static endurance. He had no levers to pull, no dials to check, only the rivets to count. He looked at them again, the rivets on the steel strap. They were comforting in their permanence. They didn't change, they didn't move, they just were. He counted them in groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was a waltz rhythm, a slow, frozen waltz in the dark. The snow around his boots had risen. It was now well past his ankles, creeping up his shins. He was being planted. The wind was gardening, banking the snow around him like soil around a sapling. He didn't move his legs. The snow was insulation. It kept the wind off the felt of his boots. It was a symbiotic relationship. The snow protected him from the wind, and he gave the snow a shape to form around. He looked at the drift. It was smooth, curved, beautiful. It looked like the flank of a white animal sleeping at his feet. He shifted his grip on the rifle, his mittens sliding on the frozen wood of the stock. The leather sling was stiff as a board. It stood out in a loop, refusing to hang straight. The cold had stolen the flexibility from the leather, turning it into a rigid material. Everything was hardening. The world was becoming a sculpture. A statue of a guard, a statue of a train, a statue of a landscape. He wondered if he stopped moving completely, would he turn to stone? Would his heart stop beating and become a pebble of ice in his chest? The thought was not scary. It was peaceful, a cessation of effort. He took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, biting air. It stung his nostrils, freezing the tiny hairs inside. He felt the cold air travel down his throat, a column of ice entering his core. He visualized it cooling his blood, slowing his pulse. Thump, thump, thump. His heart was a slow drum beating a retreat. He forced himself to exhale, to push the cold out. The white cloud appeared again, swirling around his head. It was his flag, his signal. I am still here. I am still burning. He looked at the space between the wagons. It was a dark canyon, shadowed and deep. The wind howled through it, a tunnel of moving air. He could see the coupling chains, heavy iron links that hung down, coated in frost. They swung slightly in the wind, clinking together with a dull, muffled sound. Clink, clink. It was the sound of a prisoner's chains. The train was a prisoner of the ice. It could not move. It could not escape. It was chained to the track by the frost. He rubbed his arm with his free hand, the rough wool of the mitten scratching against the rough wool of the coat. Scritch, scritch. The friction generated no heat, only sound. It was a gesture of comfort, a self-embrace. He was hugging himself, holding himself together. The coat was big, too big. He felt small inside it, a shrunken man in a giant's garment. The cold had shrunk him. He felt withered, dried out like a leaf in winter. He looked at the number 31 on the side of the wagon. The paint was peeling, flaking off in chips. Underneath the white paint, the wood was gray. The number was fading. Soon it would be gone. The train would be anonymous, just a line of gray boxes in the snow. Who would know which one held the gold? Did it matter? If they were all buried, they were all equal. The snow was the great equalizer. It covered the gold and the wood and the iron and the man with the same white blanket. The horizon was a myth. There was no line where the earth met the sky. There was only the gradient of gray, dark gray at the bottom, lighter gray at the top. He was standing in the dark gray. He was part of the darkness. He felt a kinship with the shadows. They were his companions. They didn't speak. They didn't demand anything. They just existed. He watched his own shadow on the snow. It was long, stretched out, distorted. It looked like a monster, a tall, thin creature with a rifle. He waved his hand slightly. The shadow waved back. It was his reflection in the dark mirror of the night. The wind gusted harder this time. It threw a sheet of snow against the side of the wagon. Whap! The sound was soft, like a handful of flour thrown against a wall. The snow stuck to the wood, filling the cracks, smoothing the surface. The wagon was being plastered. It was being sealed. The wind was building a tomb. He watched the snow cling to the wood. It was white, pure, clean. It covered the dirt, the soot, the scars. It made the wagon new again. A white wagon for a white journey. He closed his eyes. The darkness was a relief. The visual input was too much. The blue, the gray, the white, it was exhausting. He rested his eyes. He listened. The wind, whoosh. The train, creak. The silence, hum. He was floating in a sea of sound, a cold, dark sea. He felt weightless. The heaviness of the coat was gone. The pain in his legs was gone. He was drifting. Snap, a sound from the rifle, the wood stock contracting. It woke him. He opened his eyes. The world rushed back. The heavy coat, the numb feet, the cold lantern. He was back. He was the guard. He had a duty. He had to stand. He shifted his weight. Left foot, right foot. Thump, thump. He was still solid. He was still there. He looked at the lantern flame. It was his clock. As long as it burned, he had time. When it went out, time would end. He watched the oil level. It was low, but it would last. It had to last. He focused on the blue part of the flame right at the base of the wick. It was the hottest part, the center of the energy. He stared at it, trying to absorb the heat with his eyes, trying to pull the fire into his mind. The train stood still. The wind blew, the snow fell. The night deepened. The guard stood his watch, a statue of wool and felt, a sentinel of the frost, waiting for the dawn that was still hours away, waiting for the train to move, waiting for the world to thaw, but the thaw was a dream. The frost was the reality, and the reality was heavy and cold and silent. He breathed in, he breathed out. The cloud drifted away. The silence returned. The watch continued. The passage of time had become a concept without a reference point, a fluid dimension that had frozen solid alongside the water and the earth. The guard stood within a bubble of perception that had shrunk to the immediate radius of the lantern's dying light. The darkness pressing in was no longer a void. It was a physical weight, a massive accumulation of slate-gray atmosphere that leaned against the train and the man with the pressure of a collapsing building. The wind had stripped away the loose snow from the open step and was now depositing it in hard, sculpted drifts against the leeward side of the wagons. The train was being buried, not by a soft fall of flakes, but by a gritty, horizontal bombardment of ice particles that scoured the wood and polished the metal. He looked down at the lantern. The reservoir of oil was perilously low, a dark, viscous pool at the bottom of the glass vessel. The wick, blackened and charred at the tip, was drinking the last dregs of the fuel. The flame had shrunk to a small, desperate bead of orange light, no larger than a thumbprint. It flickered nervously, casting erratic, jumping shadows that made the wheels of the train appear to be rotating backwards in slow motion. The light was weak, barely illuminating the toe of his boot, but in the profound darkness of the Siberian night, it was a beacon. It was the only source of color in a world rendered in monochrome. The orange was dirty, mixed with the smoke of the burning wick, a bruised and sullen hue that offered no warmth, only visibility. The guard felt the cold invading the deepest layers of his clothing. It had bypassed the greatcoat, penetrated the wool of the tunic, and was now settling into the marrow of his bones. It was a heavy, dull sensation, a slowing down of the internal clock. His heart beat with a sluggish, reluctant rhythm, thud, 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 pushing blood that felt as thick as syrup through veins that had constricted to the width of threads. He was becoming a creature of the environment, his body temperature dropping to meet the ambient frost halfway. There was no shivering now. The shivering had stopped an hour ago, replaced by a rigid, wooden stiffness. To move, a muscle required a conscious, deliberate command from a brain that felt foggy and distant. He focused his eyes on the texture of the snow immediately in front of him. In the dim light, it looked like a landscape of the moon, a terrain of craters and ridges composed of millions of tiny, sharp crystals. The wind was moving the surface layer constantly, a flowing river of ice dust that hissed as it passed over the harder pack underneath. Hiss. S-H-H-H. Hiss. It was the sound of erosion, the sound of the earth being worn away by the air. He watched a single ridge of snow slowly disintegrate, the crystals being picked up one by one and carried off into the dark. It was a microscopic tragedy, a destruction of form that went unnoticed by the universe, witnessed only by a freezing man with a rifle. The train car beside him was a cliff of silence. The wood had ceased to groan, it had settled into its final, frozen shape. The planks were contracted tight against the iron frame, the gaps sealed by the ice. The wagon looked solid, impenetrable, a monolith of dark timber. He reached out and touched the side of the car with his mitten. Thump. The sound was dead, absorbed instantly by the density of the wood. There was no echo. The train was full of gold, full of weight. He imagined the interior again, the darkness inside the box. It would be absolute. No light had entered that space since they left the last station. The gold bars were sitting in the pitch black, cold and heavy, pressing down on the floorboards with a relentless gravity. He thought of the value of the cargo, millions of rubles, the treasury of a nation. It was an abstract number, a concept that belonged to a world of banks and cities and warm rooms. Out here, the value was zero. You could not trade a gold bar for a piece of wood to burn. You could not eat it. You could not wear it. It was just metal, heavy, yellow metal. It was a burden, a curse. It was the reason he was standing here, freezing to death on a nameless stretch of track in the middle of nowhere. The gold demanded a guard, and the guard paid with his heat. It was a transaction of energy, a trade of life for metal. The wind gusted, harder this time, a sudden shove that rocked him back on his heels. He stumbled slightly, his boot slipping on the polished ice of the trackside path. He caught his balance, planting the stock of the rifle in the snow like a third leg. The movement sent a jolt of pain through his stiff shoulders, a sharp reminder that his body was still capable of feeling. He grunted, a low sound that was lost in the scarf. The sound was swallowed by the wool. He righted himself, settling back into his stance. The wind laughed, a low, hollow moan that swept around the end of the train and vanished down the line. He looked at the undercarriage of the wagon. The brake rigging was a complex web of rods and levers hanging down between the wheels. It was coated in a thick layer of rime, fuzzy and white, making the metal look like it was covered in fur. The brake shoes were frozen to the wheels, a bond of iron and ice that would take a sledgehammer to break. The air hoses, usually flexible rubber, were rigid pipes, hard as stone. If he were to bend one, it would snap. The train was paralyzed. It was not just stopped, it was fossilized. It had become part of the geology of the region, a seam of iron and wood running through the stratum of the snow. His breath was a constant companion, a rhythmic cloud that marked the passage of time. In, out, white, fade, in, out, white, fade. He watched the steam rise, curling in the draft of the lantern. It was the only part of him that was truly mobile. The rest of him was heavy, anchored. The greatcoat weighed 50 pounds. The boots weighed 10. The rifle weighed 9. The ammunition pouches, the belt, the hat, it all added up. He was carrying 100 pounds of gear, standing still. Gravity was pulling him down, trying to merge him with the earth. He resisted. He kept his spine straight. He kept his head up. He was the vertical line in a horizontal world. He looked up at the sky. The heavy cloud layer was still there, a low ceiling of oppressive gray. But there was a subtle change in the texture of the dark. It was not lighter exactly, but less dense. A thinning of the fabric of the night. It might be the first suggestion of a dawn that was still hours away, or it might just be a shift in the atmosphere, a movement of the upper air. He stared at a patch of sky directly above him, trying to see through the clouds. There was nothing, just the endless, layered gray. It felt like the sky was resting on the roof of the train, pressing it down into the snow. He shifted his gaze to the coupling between the wagons. The heavy steel hook and the chain link were frozen into a solid sculpture. The slack in the chain was gone. The metal was taut, contracted by the cold. A long icicle hung from the bottom of the loop, a clear, sharp dagger that pointed at the snow. It had grown longer since he last looked. It was feeding on the invisible moisture in the air, growing crystal by crystal. He had an urge to break it, to alter the world in some small way. He reached out with the barrel of his rifle and tapped the icicle. Tink. The sound was like a tiny bell. The icicle shattered, falling in a shower of glittering shards. The destruction was satisfying. He had made a mark. He had changed the shape of the train. The silence returned, heavier than before. The tink of the breaking ice had been a violation of the quiet, and the silence rushed back to heal the wound. He listened to the ringing in his ears. Ee. It was the sound of the nervous system idling, a high-pitched carrier wave of the brain. He tried to tune it out to focus on the external sounds. The wind, whoosh, the snow, hiss, the wood, creak. These were the sounds of reality. The ringing was the sound of isolation. He thought about the concept of waiting. He was waiting for coal, waiting for a clear track, waiting for the whites, waiting for the reds, waiting for the spring. It was all the same. Waiting was a state of being, a passive endurance. He was not an active participant in history. He was a piece of scenery, a prop on the stage. The play was about the gold, about the war, about the leaders. He was just the extra, the figure in the background holding a spear or a rifle. He was the texture of the scene. His feet were 2 blocks of wood. He could no longer wiggle his toes. The connection was broken. He sent the command move, but there was no response. Just a vague sense of pressure where his feet used to be. He knew he should be worried, frostbite, gangrene, amputation. The words floated through his mind like detached balloons. They didn't seem to apply to him. They belonged to a medical textbook, to a hospital in a city. Here there was no hospital. There was only the snow. If his feet froze, they froze. It was a fact, not a problem. He stamped his boots again, Thump, thump. The vibration traveled up his shin bones. Good. The bones were still there. The lantern flared, a sudden burst of consumption as the wick found a pocket of unburnt oil. The light jumped, illuminating the rivets on the side of the wagon with a stark, sudden clarity. They stood out like craters on a dark planet, their shadows stretching long and sharp across the wood. He counted them again. It was a ritual, a prayer. Top row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Middle row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bottom row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 15 rivets, 15 anchors. They were his friends. They were reliable, they never moved, they never complained, they just held. He leaned his forehead against the cold wood of the wagon. The rim of his fur hat took the contact, cushioning the bone. He closed his eyes. The world disappeared. There was only the smell of the damp wool, the sound of the wind, and the feeling of the cold. He felt a wave of tiredness wash over him, a deep, narcotic desire to sleep. It would be so easy. Just slide down the side of the wagon, sit in the snow, pull the coat over his head. The snow would cover him in an hour. He would be warm. He would be safe. He jerked his head back. No, the thought was a trap. The sleep was death. He shook his head violently, rattling the ice on his collar. Wake up. He resumed his patrol, 3 steps left. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The snow was higher now, almost to his knees. It was hard work to lift his boots. He had to drag them through the drift. He turned, 3 steps right. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He was plowing a furrow in the snow, a small trench of his own making. He walked back and forth, a pendulum swinging in the dark. Left, right, left, right. It kept the blood moving. It kept the heart beating. It kept the death at bay. The wind had a voice now. It was whispering words he couldn't understand, syllables of ice and air. SSS, uo. It sounded like a chant, a litany of the North. He listened, trying to decode the message. Was it a warning, a greeting, a eulogy? It was just the wind. It meant nothing. But in the dark, the mind sought meaning. It looked for patterns in the chaos. He saw faces in the snow drifts. He heard voices in the wind. He was hallucinating. It was normal. It was the fatigue. He looked at the rifle in his hands, the Mosin Nagant, a tool of precision. The rear sight was graduated to 2,000 arshins, 2,000 paces. He looked out into the dark. He couldn't see 2 paces, let alone 2,000. The sights were useless. The enemy was invisible. The enemy was everywhere. The cold surrounded him on all sides, pressing in, looking for a gap in his armor. A loose button, a torn seam, a thin sock. It was a siege, a war of attrition. He adjusted the scarf, pulling it up over the bridge of his nose. The wool was frozen solid, a mask of ice. It scratched his skin, raw and tender. He didn't care. It blocked the wind. He breathed into the wool, melting the inner layer of frost. The moisture trickled down his chin, cold and clammy. He wiped it away with the back of his mitten. The mitten was hard as a rock. It felt like being touched by a piece of wood. The train groaned again. A long, deep sound that seemed to come from the very iron of the chassis. Grrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr wheel was shrinking, pulling, twisting. The forces inside the metal were immense. He wondered if the train would snap, if the couplings would shatter and the wagons would drift apart, floating away on the sea of snow. But they held. The iron was stubborn. It was Russian iron. It was used to the cold. He looked at the wheel again. The hub was a black void. The spokes were gray bars. The rim was a silver circle of frost. It was a perfect shape. The circle, the symbol of eternity, the wheel that went nowhere. He stared at the hub. It was the eye of the train, a blind eye staring into the dark. He felt a kinship with the wheel. They were both round, both hard, both stuck. A single snowflake, larger than the rest, landed on the back of his glove. He brought it up close to his face, squinting in the dim light. It was a masterpiece of geometry. A six-pointed star with intricate branching arms, each one identical. It was perfect, and it was melting. The heat from his hand, even through the thick mitten, was enough to destroy it. The points rounded, the arms collapsed, and it turned into a drop of water, a gray smear on the leather. He felt a pang of sadness. He had destroyed perfection. He wiped the drop away. The horizon to the east was still dark, but was it a lighter shade of dark? He couldn't be sure. The eyes played tricks. He wanted it to be lighter. He wanted the sun, but the sun was a memory, a story told by old men. Here there was only the lantern, the artificial sun. He looked down at it. The flame was even smaller now, a tiny blue ghost with an orange tip. It was dying. The oil was gone. The wick was burning itself. It wouldn't last much longer, maybe an hour, maybe less. Then the dark would be complete. He felt a sudden calm. It didn't matter. If the light went out, he would still stand. He knew where the train was. He knew where the snow was. He didn't need to see them. He could feel them. The weight, the cold, the silence. These things didn't need light. They existed in the dark just as well. He was ready for the dark. He was part of it. He leaned back against the wagon, settling his weight. He locked his knees. He tucked his chin. He was a statue again, a gargoyle on the cathedral of the gold train. He waited. The wind blew. The snow fell. The time passed, drop by drop, flake by flake. The cold was a patient lover, holding him close, whispering in his ear, promising him sleep. But he did not sleep. He stood. He watched. He endured. The rivets, 1, 2, 3, still there. The wheel still there. The track still there. The world was stable, frozen but stable. He took a breath. In, out. The white cloud rose up, a offering to the sky. I am here, it said. I am still here. And the silence answered, absorbing the cloud, absorbing the thought, leaving only the man and the train and the snow. The night stretched on, a long, gray road that led nowhere. The guard stood on the road, refusing to move. He was the anchor. He was the brake. He was the only thing stopping the world from sliding into the abyss. He held the line. He held the cold. He held the gold. The flame of the lantern had entered its terminal phase. It was no longer a steady tongue of fire, but a nervous, palpitating organ of light that gasped for the oxygen it could no longer effectively turn into heat. The oil in the reservoir was gone, evaporated into the dry Siberian air, or consumed by the thirsty cotton of the wick. Now, the fire was feeding on the wick itself, a cannibalistic consumption of the very material that supported it. The light had changed quality. It had lost the rich, deep amber hue of the burning kerosene, and had thinned into a sickly, pale yellow edged with the blue of incomplete combustion. It cast shadows that were not solid but trembling, shivering across the snow in time with the dying sputters of the lamp. The guard watched this death struggle with a detached, clinical fascination. It was the only event occurring in the entire visible universe. He observed the carbon building up on the tip of the wick, a black, crusty bloom that choked the flame. The glass of the chimney, already streaked with soot, was now darkening rapidly as the combustion became dirty. The circle of illumination on the snow was shrinking, pulling inward like a receding tide. The boundary between the light and the dark was no longer a gradient but a sharp, jagged line that moved closer to his boots with every second. The world was closing in. The visible sphere of his existence was collapsing. He did not reach down to adjust the knob. There was nothing to adjust. The physics of the situation were absolute. Fuel was required for fire, and there was no fuel. It was a simple equation, as cold and undeniable as the frost on the rails. Sputter, the sound was wet, a gasp of the dying lamp. The flame dropped low, almost vanishing into the burner, then surged back up one last time, a desperate flare of orange that illuminated the rivets on the wagon wheel with a sudden, startling clarity. For a second the iron looked like gold, bathed in the warm light. Then, with a soft phut, the flame detached itself from the wick, hovered for a fraction of a second as a ghost of blue gas, and vanished. The dark rushed in instantly. It was a physical blow, a heavy wave of slate-gray emptiness that slammed against the guard's retinas, erasing the wheel, the snow, and the lantern in a single heartbeat. For a long moment he was blind. His eyes, adapted to the bright point of the flame, could not process the sudden absence of photons. He saw only the afterimage of the fire, a bright, burning spot of green and purple that floated in the center of his vision, drifting aimlessly against the black. It was a phantom light, a memory of warmth that his brain refused to let go of. He blinked, trying to clear the hallucination, but it persisted, a stubborn scar on his sight. He stood perfectly still, afraid to move in a world he could no longer verify. The ground beneath his feet felt less solid, the air around him more fluid. Without the visual anchor of the lantern, he felt untethered, as if he might drift away into the void like the smoke from the extinguished wick. Slowly, very slowly, the chemistry of his eyes adjusted. The visual purple in his retinas regenerated, switching from the cones that saw color to the rods that saw only light and shadow. The world began to reassemble itself, not as a place of form and texture, but as a sketch in varying shades of charcoal and indigo. The darkness was not absolute black. It was a deep, pervasive blue, illuminated by the faintest scattering of starlight through the heavy cloud deck and the natural luminescence of the snow itself. The snow held a ghostly, internal light, a phosphorescence of trapped energy that defined the ground against the heavier darkness of the sky. The train emerged from the gloom as a silhouette. It was no longer a collection of wood and iron details. It was a solid, monolithic shape, a black wall that cut the universe in half. The sharp edges of the roof, the curve of the wheels, the texture of the planks, all were gone, replaced by a single dark mass. The guard reached out with his mitten and touched the side of the wagon. Thump. The tactile feedback was the same. The wood was still there. The train was still real. It had not vanished with the light. It had simply become part of the night. The smell of the extinguished lantern reached him. It was a sharp, acrid scent of burnt cotton and hot metal, a smell of failure. It hung in the still air around his knees, a small cloud of olfactory memory. He breathed it in. It was a sad smell. The smell of a house after the candles are blown out. The smell of an end. He felt a pang of loneliness that was sharper than before. The lantern had been a companion, a living thing that shared his vigil. Now it was just a cold metal box, another piece of debris in the snow. He was truly alone now, alone with the gold. The cold seemed to intensify in the darkness. It was a psychological effect, he knew. The light had provided no real heat, but the sensation was real enough. The air felt sharper, biting at the exposed skin around his eyes with renewed malice. The darkness felt colder than the light. It felt heavier. He hunched his shoulders, pulling his head down further into the collar of his greatcoat. The wool was stiff, freezing hard where his breath had dampened it. The ice on his scarf was a jagged ridge against his chin. He could feel the frost growing on his eyelashes, thickening the white rime until his vision was framed by a blurred white lace. He looked down at where the lantern should be. He could barely make out the shape of it, a small, dark lump in the snow. It looked like a stone or a frozen bird. It had lost its meaning. It was no longer a source of light, it was just an obstacle. If he moved his feet, he might kick it. He decided not to move his feet. He would stand exactly where he was. The snow had already begun to bury the lantern. A fine drift of powder was curling around the base, climbing the glass chimney. By morning it would be gone, a bump in the drift. The step erased everything. The wind had not changed. It still blew from the north, a steady, relentless pressure. But in the dark, the sound seemed louder. Without the visual distraction of the flame, his hearing became acute. He could hear the individual grains of snow hitting the side of the wagon. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded like sand being thrown against a coffin. He could hear the creak of the leather sling on his rifle as he breathed. Creak, creak. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a high-pitched whine that sounded like the wind in telephone wires. Ee. It was the soundtrack of isolation. He thought of the gold inside the wagon. In the dark, the gold was even more abstract. It was just a density in the void. He imagined the bars sitting there in the pitch blackness. They didn't need light. They were perfect in the dark. They were cold, hard, and indifferent. The gold was sleeping the sleep of the inanimate. It had been dug from the dark earth, processed in fire, and now returned to the dark. It was at home here. He was the intruder. He was the biological anomaly in a mineral world. He felt the weight of the rifle in his hands. It was a comfort, a solid, heavy object that had a purpose. He ran his thumb along the wood of the stock, feeling the smooth grain through the mitten. The wood was cold, lifeless. He wondered if the firing pin was frozen. If he had to shoot, would it fire, or would the spring shatter? The question was academic. There was nothing to shoot. The darkness hid no enemies, only the emptiness. The enemy was the temperature, and you could not shoot the temperature. He tried to gauge the time. How long had the lantern burned? 4 hours, 5. It felt like a lifetime. The night was a tunnel with no end. He looked to the east, searching for a sign of dawn. The horizon was invisible, a blur where the gray of the ground met the gray of the sky. There was no line of light, no purple bruise of morning. The world was suspended in the deep hours, the hours when the soul is weakest, when the body wants to stop. The wolf hour, the hour of the frost. He shifted his weight. Crunch. The sound was startlingly loud in the darkness. The snow under his boots had frozen into a solid block. He was standing on a pedestal of ice. He felt the cold seeping up through the soles of his valanky, seeking the heat of his feet. He wiggled his toes. The movement was sluggish. The signals from his nerves were delayed, traveling slowly through the cold flesh. He had to concentrate to feel them. Left big toe. Right big toe. They were there. Distant, but there. The silence was a presence. It wrapped around the train like a blanket. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that absorbed all thought. He found himself staring at nothing, his mind blank, his consciousness drifting. He was becoming a camera recording a scene that no one would ever see. The dark train, the dark snow, the dark man. It was a composition in negative space. A sudden crack from the forest echoed through the night. Crack. It was the sound of a tree exploding from the frost. The sap inside the trunk had frozen, expanded, and split the wood from the inside out. The sound was violent, sharp, a gunshot in the quiet. It reminded him of the power of the cold. It was a force that could break trees, snap iron, stop hearts. He felt a shiver of respect. The winter was a giant, flexing its muscles in the dark. He leaned back against the wagon. The wood was a wall at his back. He felt the solidity of the train. It was an anchor. Without it, he felt he might fall over, blown down by the wind like a dry stalk of grass. The train was his world. The 31st wagon was his home. He knew every rivet, every plank, every scratch. In the dark, he could see them in his mind. He mapped the surface of the wagon with his memory, the peeling paint, the iron strap, the frozen lock. It was his territory. He closed his eyes. The difference between eyes open and eyes closed was minimal now. The darkness was inside and outside. He floated in the gray. He saw patterns of light that weren't there, swirling nebulas of faint blue, geometric grids of gray. The brain, starved of input, was creating its own entertainment. He watched the show. It was a silent movie of abstract shapes. It was peaceful. Then a thought surfaced. Morning. The concept seemed alien, a time of light, a time of warmth. It felt like a myth, a story told to children to make them sleep. The sun will come up, would it? Or had the sun frozen too? Had the celestial mechanics ground to a halt in the ice? It felt possible. It felt like the train had driven off the edge of the world into a place where the sun never shone, a place of eternal twilight. He forced his eyes open. He had to watch. Even if there was nothing to see, he had to be the witness. He scanned the darkness, moving his head slowly from left to right. The motion cracked the ice on his collar, crinkle. The sound was close, intimate. He looked at the shape of the next wagon. It was a dark block identical to his own. And the next one, and the next. A line of blocks fading into the nothing. The wind picked up a handful of loose snow and threw it into his face. The crystals stung like needles. They found the gap between his scarf and his hat, hitting the sensitive skin around his eyes. He blinked rapidly, tears forming and freezing instantly in the corners of his eyes. The pain was sharp, immediate. It woke him up. It was a reminder, I am alive. I feel pain. He welcomed the pain. It was better than the numbness. He wiped his face with his mitten. The leather was rough, abrasive. It scraped the ice away. He could feel the contours of his own face, the cheekbones, the nose, the ridge of the brow. His face felt like a mask, stiff and foreign. He wondered what he looked like. A monster of ice and wool, a ghost. If someone saw him now standing in the dark, would they run? He was the spirit of the train, the guardian of the horde. He looked down at the snow again. He could see the faint ridges of the drift he had been standing in. The wind had carved it into a sharp wave, a dune of ice. The crest of the wave was translucent, glowing with a faint inner light. It was beautiful, a sculpture made by the air. He wanted to touch it, to feel the smoothness, but he couldn't reach it. He was trapped in his coat, trapped in his boots. He thought of the engineer again. Was the fire still burning in the locomotive, or had it gone out too? If the fire went out, the water would freeze, the boiler would burst, the train would die. He listened for the sound of the engine, the faint chuff. Chuff was gone, swallowed by the wind or stopped. He strained his ears. Nothing, just the wind, whoosh, whoosh. The train was silent. It might be dead already. A corpse of iron lying in the snow. He felt a sudden urge to walk to the engine, to check, to see the fire, but he couldn't. His orders were to stay, to guard the 31st wagon. If he left, the gold would be unguarded. The logic was circular, absurd. Who would take the gold in this darkness? The wolves, the wind, but orders were orders. Orders were the only structure left. If he abandoned his orders, he abandoned himself. He would just be a man wandering in the snow, a man with no purpose. And a man with no purpose would die. So he stood. He let the darkness wrap around him. He let the cold penetrate the coat. He let the silence fill his ears. He was the guard. He was the statue. He was the night. The temperature dropped again. He could feel it. A physical tightening of the air. The moisture in the atmosphere was precipitating out, falling as diamond dust. The air was becoming clearer, sharper, deadlier. The stars, hidden behind the clouds, were burning with a cold fire. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their gaze. Cold, distant eyes watching the speck on the snow. He began to count again, not rivets this time. He couldn't see them clearly enough. He counted breaths. 1, in, out, 2, in, out, 3, in, out. It was a slow count, a funeral march. Each breath was a victory. Each breath was a defiance. He was stealing oxygen from the winter and turning it into life. He was a machine for converting cold air into warm smoke. He looked at the shadow of the train on the snow. It was a black pool, a void where the light could not reach. The shadow was growing. Or maybe the world was shrinking, the distinction was meaningless. He was standing in the shadow, he was part of the shadow. He checked his hands, he banged them together. Thud, no feeling, just the sound. Thud, he did it again. Thud, harder, thud, a faint tingle, a spark of nerve endings firing. Good. He adjusted his stance. The snow creaked under his boots. A high, dry squeak, the sound of extreme cold. He imagined the snow crystals crushing under his weight, shattering like glass. He was walking on glass, a sea of broken glass. The darkness was a heavy liquid. He was submerged in it. It filled his nose, his mouth, his ears. It tasted of iron and ice. He drank it in. He became the darkness. He became the cold. He became the guard of the gold train, and he waited. For what he didn't know, but he waited. The darkness that had swallowed the lantern did not remain static. It began to cure, hardening like concrete poured into the mold of the valley. The guard stood encased within it, a fossil in the making, waiting for the geological pressure of the night to complete his transformation into stone. The absence of the flame had removed the last reference point of scale. Without the small, defined circle of orange light to measure against, the train seemed to grow to impossible proportions, stretching upwards into the gray void until it scraped the belly of the cloud layer. The guard felt himself shrinking, condensing into a dense, cold point of consciousness that was barely larger than the head of a rivet. The world had simplified itself into two absolute states, the weight of the gold and the grip of the frost. He was no longer standing on snow. He was standing on a cloud of frozen vapor that had petrified into a solid mass. The sensation in his feet had retreated entirely, withdrawing up the shins to the knees, leaving behind two heavy wooden blocks that he maneuvered by remote command. He shifted his weight, a slow, tectonic movement of the hips. The leather of his belt creaked, a dry, rasping sound that was loud in the vacuum of the silence. Irk. It was the sound of an old ship settling in the ice. He leaned his shoulder against the wagon, feeling the texture of the wood through the thick wool of his coat. The wood was no longer just cold. It was actively sucking the heat from his body, a parasitic entity that fed on his warmth to maintain its own frozen equilibrium. The air he breathed was a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, and ice dust. It entered his lungs as a solid column, chilling the blood in the alveoli before it could circulate. He visualized his heart pumping this cooled blood, sending a slow blue tide through his veins. Thud thud, pause, thud thud. The rhythm was lethargic, a reluctant beat that seemed to question the necessity of the next one. Why beat? Why push? The stillness was so much easier. The stillness was the natural state of the universe. Movement was an aberration, a temporary rebellion against the laws of thermodynamics. He felt the seduction of the stop, to just let the heart rest, to let the chest fall and not rise again. He shook his head, a violent, jerky motion that rattled the ice on his collar. No. The word did not leave his lips, it echoed inside his skull, a command shouted in an empty room. He was the guard. The guard did not stop. The guard stood. He focused on the visual field again. The darkness was not uniform. As his eyes strained against the gloom, he began to see the grain of the night. It was a textured darkness, full of swirling gray motes and deep, indigo shadows that pulsed with a slow, biological rhythm. The air itself seemed to have a fabric, a weave of heavy, dark threads that hung like a curtain before his face. He looked at where the wheel of the wagon should be. He could sense its mass, a dense black circle against the dark gray snow. The spokes were invisible, but he knew they were there, thick iron arms holding up the weight of the treasure. The gold inside the wagon was a presence he could feel in his teeth. It was a metallic taste in the back of his throat, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with gravity. The gold was the core of the cold. It was a radioactive isotope of freezing energy, radiating a silent field that stopped time. He imagined the bars glowing with a dark, blue light, illuminating the interior of the crate with the color of deep ocean water. The wind had dropped to a whisper, a low, sibilant hiss that moved along the ground like a snake. SSSSSSS. It was exploring the contours of the drift, smoothing out the disturbances, erasing his footprints. The evidence of his existence was being wiped away. If he stepped away now, within an hour there would be no sign that a man had ever stood here. The step was a jealous guardian of its own emptiness. It did not tolerate the marks of human passage. He looked down at his boots. They were already half buried, merged with the drift. The snow was climbing him, claiming him. He was becoming a feature of the terrain, a vertical drift in a horizontal world. He tried to flex his fingers inside the mittens. The movement was stiff, hydraulic. The joints felt rusty, grinding against each other. He could not feel the texture of the wool lining anymore. He could only feel the resistance. He banged his gloved hands together. Whump. The sound was dull, muffled by the layers. It was like hitting a pillow with a stone. He did it again. Whump. It was a signal to the darkness. I am solid. I am here. But the darkness absorbed the sound without an echo. The silence was a sponge, soaking up every vibration, every noise, leaving nothing but the wind. A hallucination began to form in the periphery of his vision. He saw, or thought he saw, a figure standing by the next wagon, a tall gray shape wrapped in a coat like his own. He stared at it, narrowing his eyes against the stinging crystals. The shape did not move. It was just a shadow, a trick of the light and the fatigue, but his mind wanted it to be real. He wanted a companion. Even a ghost would be company. He blinked, and the shape resolved itself into a trick of the snow piled against the coupling. A snowman built by the wind. He felt a wave of disappointment that was almost physical. He was alone, the only living thing in a cemetery of ice. He looked up at the sky. The cloud cover was a solid, oppressive weight. It felt as if the ceiling of the world had lowered, pressing down on the top of his hat. There was no moon, no stars, just the infinite layered gray of the storm clouds. They were moving, sliding over each other in slow tectonic sheets, but from the ground they looked static, a roof of slate. He felt trapped. The world was a box and the lid was nailed shut. The air inside the box was getting stale, used up. He took a deep breath, trying to find a pocket of fresh oxygen. The air was thin, sharp, and dry. It burned his throat. The rifle strap dug into his shoulder. The pain was a dull ache, a constant reminder of the burden. He shifted the weapon, moving it to the other shoulder. The movement required a complex coordination of muscles that were slow to respond. He had to think about every step. Lift arm, grip wood, slide strap, lower arm. It was like operating a puppet. The rifle settled onto the left shoulder. The change in balance was disorienting for a moment. He swayed, his boots slipping on the hard-packed path. He caught himself against the wagon. The wood was there, always there, the silent partner. He thought of the engineer again, far ahead in the darkness. Was he asleep? Was the fire out? If the fire was out, the water in the boiler would be freezing. The steel of the boiler would be contracting. Ping, ping. He could hear the phantom sounds of the metal failing. He imagined the ice expanding inside the pipes, bursting the copper, splitting the iron. The locomotive would be a dead beast, its belly full of ice instead of fire. And behind it, the long line of wagons, each one a coffin for the gold. And him, the undertaker, standing watch over the funeral procession that never moved. He closed his eyes. The visual noise of the dark was replaced by the auditory noise of the silence. The The ringing in his ears was louder now. Ee. It was a scream of the nerves, a high-pitched frequency that drilled into his skull. He tried to hum a low note to cancel it out. The sound of his own voice was shocking. It was hoarse, cracked, weak. It sounded like a stranger's voice, a voice from a grave. He stopped humming. The silence rushed back, triumphant. The cold was a liquid now. It was seeping through the pores of his skin, entering the bloodstream. He could feel it in his stomach, a heavy, cold stone that sat where his hunger used to be. He wasn't hungry anymore. The body had given up on food. It only wanted heat, and there was no heat. He remembered the concept of summer, green grass, blue water, the sun. It seemed like a fantasy world, a different planet. Had he ever really lived there? Or had he always been here, standing in the snow? The memories were fading, bleached white by the frost. He looked at the tracks. The rails were invisible, buried under the drift, but he knew where they were. He could feel the iron presence under the snow. The rails were the only thing that connected him to the world. They were the iron road. If he started walking and didn't stop, he would eventually reach a station. A building, a stove, but he couldn't walk. He was the guard. The guard stands. The guard waits. The guard freezes. It was the law of the line. He leaned his head back, resting it against the wagon. The rim of his hat crunched against the wood. He stared up into the void. He began to count again, not numbers this time. He counted the beats of the silence. 1 silent beat, 2 silent beats. It was a meditation, a way to slow the mind down to match the speed of the night. The night was slow, glacial. It moved with the speed of a mountain eroding. He had to match that speed. If he moved too fast, he would break. The wind shifted, coming from the east now. It brought a slightly different scent, the smell of nothing. It was cleaner, colder if that was possible. It was the breath of the sunrise, still hours away, pushing the stale air of the night before it. He sniffed the air, expanding his nostrils. The hairs inside his nose froze instantly, sticking together. He felt a tiny spark of anticipation. East, the direction of the sun, the direction of the end, but the east was dark as the north, as dark as the west. He felt a sudden, sharp cramp in his right calf. The muscle seized up, contracting into a hard knot. The pain was exquisite. It cut through the numbness like a hot knife. He grunted, biting his lip. He tried to massage the leg through the coat, through the boot, but it was impossible. He had to just stand there and take it. The pain was a gift. It proved he was still biological, still flesh. A statue doesn't get cramps. He rode the wave of pain until it subsided into a dull throb. Thank you, he thought. Thank you for the pain. He looked at the space between the wagons, the intercar void. It was a place of deep shadow. The couplings were hidden in the dark. He imagined the iron links shivering. Do atoms shiver? Does metal feel the cold? It must. Everything feels the cold. The universe is cold. Heat is just a temporary mistake. A brief flare of energy before the inevitable return to zero. The gold understood this. The gold was patient. He adjusted his scarf, pulling it down slightly to break the ice seal. A shower of tiny crystals fell from the wool, landing on his coat. They sparkled for a second in the faint ambient light, then vanished. He rubbed his chin. The skin was numb like wax. He couldn't feel his fingers touching his face. He was touching a mask with a tool. The connection between self and body was fraying. He was a consciousness trapped in a dying machine. The train gave a sudden lurch, clang. The sound was massive, echoing down the line. A buffer had released or a coupling had slipped. The vibration traveled through the ground, shaking his boots. He grabbed the handle of the wagon door for support. The iron handle was burning cold. It felt like grabbing a live wire. He held on, grounding himself. The train was moving. No, it was just settling, adjusting its bones in the grave. The silence returned, vibrating with the aftershock of the sound. He waited for another sound. A whistle, a shout. Nothing, just the wind resuming its patrol, whoosh, whoosh. The wind didn't care about the noise. The wind didn't care about the train. The wind was busy. It had a whole continent to freeze. He felt small, insignificant, a microscopic organism on the slide of a microscope, and the scientist was the winter, watching him with a cold glass eye. He looked at the number on the wagon again. He couldn't see it in the dark, but he knew it was there. 31. He traced the shape of the numbers in his mind. 3, 1, a prime number, a lonely number, 31 wagons, 31 guards, 31 boxes of silence. He wondered about the guard on wagon 32. Was he still standing, or was he a mound of snow? He would never know. The curve of the track hid him. The distance was infinite. He felt the fatigue pressing down on his eyelids. It was a physical weight, like lead coins placed on his eyes. Sleep, the wind whispered, just close them, it's warm in the dark. He fought the urge. He widened his eyes, stretching the frozen skin. He stared into the gray. He looked for patterns. He saw a face in the clouds, a giant bearded face looking down. The Tsar, God, no, just a cloud shaped by the wind. It dissolved as he watched, turning into a shapeless smear. He began to tap the butt of his rifle against his boot. Tap, 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 a rhythmic signal, I am awake, I am awake, I am awake. The sound was tiny, pathetic, but it was his rhythm, his drum. He kept it up, tap, tap, tap. It was the heartbeat of the watch. As long as he tapped, he was alive. If the tapping stopped, the guard was gone. The air around him seemed to thicken, becoming a gel. He was swimming in the atmosphere. Every movement pushed against the resistance of the cold. He felt slow, heavy. The gravity of the planet seemed to have increased. He was being pulled down towards the center of the earth, towards the core. Is the core hot? Or is it cold too? Maybe the whole world is ice all the way down. He thought of the gold again. He imagined the crates opening, the gold bars spilling out onto the snow. Yellow metal on white snow, a beautiful contrast. He would build a house of gold bars, a small igloo of bullion. He would sit inside it, sheltered by the wealth of the empire. The gold would protect him. The gold would keep the wind out. It was a mad thought, a fevered dream of the freezing mind. He smiled, his lips cracking under the mask of ice. A house of gold in the Siberian night. He checked his feet. Tap, tap, still numb, but the sound was there. He checked his hands, clenched fists, still stiff. He checked his eyes, open, blurring. He was operating at 10% capacity. All non-essential systems were offline. Memory, offline. Hope, offline. Fear, offline. Only duty remained, and the cold. He looked to the east again. He stared at the horizon until his eyes burned. Was there a line, a faint separation of earth and sky? It was too dark to tell. It might be his imagination, but he held onto the possibility. A line meant the end of the night. A line meant the sun. He focused on that imaginary line. He poured all his will into it. Be there, he commanded. Be light. The wind gusted, swirling the snow around his waist. The drift was deep now. He was buried up to his thighs. He was a tree rooted in the ice. He didn't fight it. The snow was support. It held him up. If he fainted, he wouldn't fall. He would just lean. The snow would catch him. The snow was kind. He took a deep breath. The air was still. The wind had paused. In that pause, the cold was absolute. It was a vacuum of heat, a 0 point. He felt his soul shiver, not his body, but the spark inside. It flickered. It dimmed. It almost went out. He held his breath, protecting the spark. Stay, he whispered in his mind. Stay. He exhaled. The white cloud appeared, a ghost in the dark. It drifted up, joining the gray sky. He watched it go. He was still here. The train was still here. The gold was still here. The night was at its deepest point, the bottom of the well. There was nowhere to go but up or out. He waited, he watched, he stood, the statue of the guard waiting for the stone to crack. The transition from night to morning did not arrive with a burst of glory, nor with the sudden clarity of a rising sun. It manifested as a subtle, creeping alteration in the density of the gray. The absolute black of the deep hours began to dilute, drop by drop, with a pale, watery milkiness that seeped up from the eastern horizon. It was a dawn without color, a dawn of pure value contrast, where the world slowly regained its shape but not its warmth. The guard stood witness to this resurrection of form, his eyes fixed on the line where the earth met the sky, watching the heavy lid of the atmosphere lift by a fraction of a degree. The light that filtered through the heavy cloud deck was thin, anemic, and incredibly cold. It did not illuminate. It merely revealed the extent of the burial. The lantern at his feet had long since vanished. The snow, driven by the relentless wind of the night, had built a smooth, curved dune over the casing, erasing the object from the visual record. There was no evidence that a fire had ever burned there. The heat, the light, the smell of the oil, all had been swallowed by the step, digested, and replaced by the uniform whiteness of the drift. The guard did not look for it. He knew it was gone. He accepted its loss as he accepted the numbness in his legs and the stiffness in his hands. It was the way of things here. Objects that ceased to function were claimed by the ice. As the gray light strengthened, the train emerged from the shadows like a shipwreck rising from the ocean floor. It was a revelation of stillness. The 31st wagon was no longer a distinct vehicle. It was a continuous ridge of snow and timber. The roof was covered in a thick, sculpted cap of white, the edges hanging down in long, serrated curtains of icicles that reached almost to the ground. The iron strapping, the rivets, the handle of the sliding door, all were coated in a fuzzy, white fur of hoarfrost. The train looked soft, its hard, industrial edges blurred by the accumulation of the night. It looked like it had been standing there for a century, waiting for a thaw that was geologic eras away. The guard felt the light on his face not as warmth but as a pressure. The photons seemed to carry a physical weight, pushing against his eyelids, demanding that he see. He blinked, the movement slow and gritty. The ice that had formed on his eyelashes shattered with a tiny, audible crackle, falling onto his cheeks like diamond dust. He saw the world through a prism of tears and frost. It was a world of breathtaking desolation. The steppe stretched out in every direction, a boundless ocean of white waves, frozen in mid-roll. There were no trees visible, no distant villages, no smoke. Only the snow, the sky, and the black line of the train cutting through the nothingness. He looked down at his own body. He was a snowman. The greatcoat was entirely white, covered in a layer of rime that had bonded to the wool. The folds of the fabric were filled with drift snow. His boots were gone, buried deep beneath the smooth surface of the pack. He was planted in the earth, a vertical extension of the drift. He tried to move his legs to break the seal of the ice. Push. There was no movement. The snow had set like concrete around him. He was anchored. He was part of the foundation. The realization did not bring panic. It brought a strange, serene sense of belonging. He was where he was supposed to be. He was the post. He was the marker. The wind had changed its voice with the light. It was no longer the howling beast of the midnight hours. It was a low, mournful sigh, a continuous exhalation of the planet. H-H-H-H-H-H-H. It moved the loose powder across the surface of the drifts in serpentine patterns, rivers of white dust flowing over rivers of white ice. The sound was hypnotic, a white noise that smoothed out the jagged edges of his consciousness. It lulled him. It told him that there was no need to struggle. The struggle was over. The endurance was all that remained. He looked at the gold train's wheels. They were half buried, the iron spokes disappearing into the drift. The ice that had formed on the rims was thick, opaque, a welding of metal to rail to ground. The train was not going anywhere. The steam in the locomotive miles ahead had surely died. The fire was ash. The water was ice. The train was a monument to movement that had ceased. It was a statue of a journey. And inside the wagon, the gold sat in the dark. The light of the dawn did not reach it. The gold remained in its own private night, cold and heavy and eternal. He thought of the weight of the gold. It seemed to him now that the weight was what held the world together. If the gold were removed, the train might float away, rising into the gray clouds like a balloon. The gold was the ballast of reality. It was the heavy element that pinned them to the spinning earth. He respected the gold. It was stronger than he was. It did not need to breathe. It did not need to eat. It did not feel the cold. It simply existed, dense and yellow and silent. The sky above was a vast, flat sheet of slate. There was no texture to the clouds anymore, just a uniform, oppressive gray. It was the color of old iron, the color of a dead fire. It reflected the snow, and the snow reflected it, creating a world without shadows, a world of flat, diffused light where distance was impossible to judge. Was the horizon a mile away? 10 miles? 100? It didn't matter. It was all the same. The geography of the steppe was a geography of repetition. One drift was like another. One snowflake was like another. One moment was like another. He felt a sensation in his chest, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction. His lungs were still working. They were stubborn machinery. They pulled in the knife-sharp air, warmed it slightly, and pushed it out. In, out, in, out. The cloud of his breath was thinner now in the light. It was a faint mist that vanished almost instantly. He was losing his impact on the world. His heat was fading. He was becoming ambient. He was achieving equilibrium with the frost. He tried to remember why he was here. The orders, the war, the admiral. The words floated through his mind like debris in a slow river. They had lost their sharp edges. They were just sounds. Guard the train. Protect the reserve. Stand watch. The meaning had evaporated, leaving only the action. The act of standing was the only truth. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a function, a biological component of the security system. The silence was absolute. The wind's sigh was so constant that it became a form of silence. There were no birds, no wolves, no engines. The world had been stripped of life, leaving only the mineral and the elemental. He felt a profound peace settle over him. It was the peace of the statue, the peace of the stone. He didn't have to decide anything. He didn't have to go anywhere. He just had to be. He looked at the rivets on the wagon wall one last time. They were covered in white caps of snow, little mushrooms of ice growing on the iron stems. He didn't count them. He knew them. They were his family, the 15 iron brothers. They held the wall. The wall held the gold. He held the wall. It was a chain of dependency, a circle of strength. The cold was no longer painful. The pain had receded hours ago, leaving behind a dull, heavy comfort. His body felt enormous, swollen with the cold, yet light as a feather. He felt as if he could step out of his coat and walk across the top of the snow, leaving no footprints. He imagined himself doing it, walking away from the train, walking into the white, walking until he dissolved into the light. It was a beautiful thought, a dream of release. But he stayed. The boots held him, the duty held him, the gravity of the gold held him. He shifted his weight, a microscopic adjustment of the spine. The ice on his coat crackled, snick, a tiny sound, the only sound in the world. He was the noisemaker, the disruptor of the silence. He watched the light change on the snow. It was shifting from gray to a very pale, cold blue. The sun must be rising somewhere behind the clouds, climbing the ladder of the sky. It was a ghost sun, a hidden star that gave no heat. It only gave the day its name. Day, a word for the time when the eyes could see the nothingness. He thought of the other guards down the line. Were they standing like him? Were they statues too? He imagined a line of white figures spaced 50 yards apart, stretching for miles. A terracotta army of ice, guarding the emperor's gold, guarding the emptiness. They were brothers in the frost, united by the cold, connected by the rail. The rifle in his arms felt like part of his skeleton. The wood had fused to the wool of his mittens. The steel had fused to the leather of the sling. He was a hybrid creature, part man, part machine, part winter. He looked at the barrel. The muzzle was plugged with a small cap of snow. It didn't matter. He wouldn't shoot. The war was over here. The winter had won. The winter always won. He closed his eyes for a moment. The darkness returned, but it was a lighter darkness now, a red-gray darkness. He saw the afterimage of the snow, bright, burning white lines. He opened his eyes. The world was still there. The train, the drift, the sky, nothing had moved, nothing would ever move. He felt a slow, deep vibration in the ground. It was faint, almost imperceptible. Was it the train? Was it the earth? Was it his own blood? He listened. It was a hum, a low-frequency resonance. The song of the Siberian shield, the ancient rock beneath the snow singing to the ice. He hummed with it, a silent vibration in his throat. He was in tune. He was resonant. The air was crystalline. He could see the individual particles of ice floating in the atmosphere. Tiny, glittering dust motes dancing in the weak light. They were beautiful. They were the jewels of the air, more precious than the gold in the box. He watched one particle drift closer, closer, until it landed on his nose. It didn't melt. It stayed there, a tiny decoration, a badge of honor. He looked at the horizon again. It was blurring. The distinction between earth and sky was fading. The white of the ground was merging with the gray of the clouds. The world was becoming a single, uniform field of color, a whiteout of the senses. He felt dizzy, a slow, spinning sensation. The train was the only anchor, the black line in the white void. He held onto it with his eyes. Don't let go, he told himself. Hold the line. He remembered a fire, a real fire, in a stove, the smell of birch wood, the crackle of the bark, the heat radiating out, warming his hands, his face. It was a distant memory, like a story from a book he read a long time ago. It didn't feel real. The cold was real. The ice was real. The fire was a dream. He took a breath. In, the cold filled him. Out, the mist escaped. He was a vessel for the air, a pump, a filter. He was doing his job. He was keeping the air moving. He was keeping the time. The snow around his legs seemed to be rising. Or was he sinking? It didn't matter. The result was the same. He was becoming the snow. He was returning to the elements. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, ice to ice. He looked at the number 31. It was almost gone, covered in frost, just a faint shadow on the wood. Soon it would be invisible. The train would be nameless, just the train. The eternal train, the gold train. He felt a sense of finality. The night was over. The watch was over, but the relief didn't come, because the day was just another night. A brighter night, a colder night. The cycle would continue. The sun would rise, the sun would set, the snow would fall, the wind would blow, and he would stand. He was the gold train guard. He was the treasure in the Siberian frost. He was the keeper of the silence. He relaxed his shoulders. He locked his knees. He centered his weight. He stared ahead into the vast, white, empty distance. He did not blink. He did not move. He waited for the next flake of snow. He waited for the next breath of wind. He waited for eternity. And the snow began to fall again. Gently, silently, covering the tracks, covering the wheels, covering the guard, layer by layer, year by year, until there was nothing left but the white, silent, sleeping world.